1931. Fall asleep to hilarious history. A ledger of stumbling and striving. Written and narrated in the style of Mark Twain. This book is factually accurate and human-edited. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Bank of Austria's Hiccup. There is a particular kind of quiet that descends upon a man when he realizes his pocketbook has developed a leak. It is not the quiet of peace, you understand, but the strained, breath-holding silence of a fellow watching a dam crack. In the spring of 1931, the world found itself standing before such a dam, and the crack appeared in a place that sounded altogether too dignified to be leaking anything at all. The Creditanstalt of Vienna. Now, a bank is, in its natural state, a creature of high vanity. It carries itself with a stiff collar and a gaze that looks slightly over the top of your head, as if it is constantly appraising the net worth of your soul before deciding whether or not to offer you a chair. It is an institution built on the profound mystical faith that if everyone pretends there is plenty of gold in the vault, there shall indeed be plenty of gold in the vault. It is a collective delusion, maintained with the sort of seriousness usually reserved for coronations and funeral processions. But in May of 1931, the Creditanstalt, the very pillar of Austrian finance, the grand dame of the Danube, suffered a fit of indigestion that would have been pitiable had it not been so ruinous. It turned out that the bank had been holding on to the debts of old empires and industrial dreams that had long since withered away. They were, in the parlance of the street, holding the bag, and it was a bag filled with nothing but "I owe us," from folks who were either dead, bankrupt, or living in republics that had forgotten their own names. When the news broke, it didn't come with a bang. It came with a polite, nervous cough from the Austrian government. They whispered that the Creditanstalt was experiencing a slight liquidity problem, a bit of a hiccup, really. But in the theater of international finance, a bank sneezing is akin to a man walking into a room full of dynamite with a lit cigar. The investors, a twitchy and suspicious bunch at the best of times, took one look at the situation, smelled the smoke, and decided with sudden, frantic unanimity that they would much prefer their money to be anywhere else. It was a stampede in slow motion. The French, ever cautious and quite fond of their own coin, began pulling their assets out of Germany and Austria as if they were extracting gold teeth from a corpse. The Germans, who were already living on a diet of austerity and bad luck, looked at the gap left by the departing capital and realized they were staring into an abyss. It is a curious thing about money. It is entirely invisible, existing only as a ghost of mutual trust. Once that trust evaporates, once the crowd decides that the emperor is not merely naked, but has stolen their wallet on his way out of the room, the whole scaffolding of civilization begins to wobble. The people of Vienna, a city accustomed to waltzes and whipped cream, found themselves treated to a new discordant rhythm. They queued outside the bank, a long, shivering line of humanity clutching passbooks like holy relics, hoping that if they only stood there long enough, the iron gates would swing open and disgorge their savings. But the gates stayed shut, or if they opened, it was only to tell the crowd that the cupboard was bare. It was a lesson in the fragility of modern life, delivered with the cold efficiency of a tombstone. One might have hoped that the other great powers of the world would have rallied to patch the hole. After all, the world is a small enough room. When the floorboards collapse in the corner, The rest of the furniture is inclined to slide toward the pit. But the nations of the earth were currently busy with the petty squabbles of schoolboys. They were, in the main, occupied with protecting their own borders, hoarding their own resources, and nursing their own particular brands of resentment. They watched the Austrian crisis unfold with the detached curiosity of a man watching a neighbor's house burn, failing to notice that the wind was blowing quite forcefully in their own direction. It was a comedy, if one has the stomach for dark humors. Here were the great minds of the age, the economists with their charts, the politicians with their speeches, and the financiers with their monocles, all caught in the gears of a machine they had built but no longer understood. They spoke of market forces and fiscal responsibility as if these were laws of nature, akin to gravity or the tide, rather than the messy, panicked inventions of men who had gambled too heavily on their own cleverness. When a bank fails, it is not merely a matter of figures in a ledger going from black to red. It is a matter of doors locking, of hearths going cold, and of the sudden, sickening realization that the rules of the game have been changed mid-match. The man on the street in 1931 learned a hard truth that his grandfather had never been forced to swallow, that his survival depended on the decisions of a man in a waistcoat 3,000 miles away, a man who viewed his livelihood as a mere decimal point to be adjusted at will. The Creditanstalt was the first domino. It stood there, tall and imposing, until the nudge of reality sent it tipping over, and as it fell, it caught the next, and the next, and the next, until the rattle of falling institutions became the soundtrack of the year. The world began to understand that it was hitched to a very expensive, very temperamental wagon, and the driver had fallen asleep at the reins. It is a sobering thought, but one that occurred to few at the time, that we are all, every one of us, merely guests at a banquet we did not organize, sitting at a table that might be snatched away at any moment. In 1931, the tablecloth was pulled back with a violent jerk, and we have been struggling to pick up the spilled wine and broken china ever since. The hiccup of a bank in Vienna was the beginning of the long gray winter of the spirit, a reminder that the world is a fragile contraption, held together by nothing more than the gossamer threads of our willingness to believe in one another. And, as the year would prove, that is a thread remarkably easy to snap. Thus began the great stumbling. The world, having grown dizzy from the dizzying heights of the 20s, found the floor rising up to meet its chin. It was a rude awakening, and the headache it brought would last a decade. But for now, in the early days of 1931, the world merely stood in the wreckage, looking at the broken bits of the Creditanstalt, and wondering, with a distinct sense of dread, just how many more of these hiccups the human race could possibly endure before it simply decided to give up the ghost and go home. Chapter 2. The Hoover Moratorium. If the failure of the Creditanstalt was the equivalent of a man noticing his trousers were on fire, the response from the world's leaders, led by that dour and well-meaning engineer in the White House, Herbert Hoover, was to organize a committee to discuss the most efficient way to draft a formal request for rain. It was a spectacle of high-minded procrastination that would have been entirely comical had the participants not been so dreadfully serious about the whole affair. Mr. Hoover, a man whose natural disposition suggested He had been born with a slide rule in his cradle and a permanent frown etched into his brow by the sheer weight of global logistics, surveyed the mounting pile of international debt, and decided that the only way to save the house was to stop paying the mortgage. He dubbed it a moratorium, a word that sounds suspiciously like a medical condition, but is, in fact, just a fancy way of saying, let us all pretend we owe each other absolutely nothing until we have finished our lunch. The proposal was noble in its simplicity, which is a polite way of saying it was naive. Mr. Hoover looked across the Atlantic at the frantic nations of Europe, nations that were currently eyeing each other with a suspicion of strayed dogs over a scrap of gristle, and suggested they hit the pause button on the entire game of financial musical chairs. He reasoned that if the Germans didn't have to pay the French, and the French didn't have to pay the Americans, then perhaps the money would stay in circulation like water in a fountain rather than disappearing into the dry, cracked earth of central banking. It was, as I have noted, much like a man trying to arrest the progress of a waterfall by holding up his hand and asking the river to wait for a quiet, contemplative moment. The river, being entirely indifferent to the laws of man, continued its descent with precisely the same enthusiasm it had possessed before the suggestion was made. The politicians, those great bumbling architects of our collective ruin, received the news with mixed emotions. Some were offended that an American should suggest such a thing, as if the request were an intrusion upon the sacred, time-honored tradition of sovereign debt-dodging. Others were relieved, clutching the proposal to their chests as if it were a life raft in a hurricane. But the most observant among them, the fellows who had spent too many years in the back rooms of diplomacy, saw the moratorium for what it truly was, a desperate, shivering admission that the machine had ground to a halt and that no amount of oiling or shouting at the gears was going to make it spin again. The negotiations for this pause were a master class in the art of saying no while appearing to nod politely. Every nation had a list of exceptions as long as a Sunday sermon. We shall agree to the pause, the French might say, while mentally crossing their fingers and checking their barricades. But only if the interest continues to accrue, and if the Germans provide a notarized letter of intent, and if the moon is in the proper alignment with the sun. It was a dance of exquisite, soul-crushing complexity. Meanwhile, the public looked on, utterly bewildered. The average fellow, the one who worked the forge or the field, heard the talk of intergovernmental debt relief, and assumed it had something to do with the price of flour. He didn't understand that the titans of finance were currently playing a game of poker where the stakes were the stability of the Western world, and the cards were marked with the tears of 1,000 clerks. It is a grand irony of human history that the more desperate our circumstances become, the more we lean on the lexicon of the academic. We do not say we are broke. We say we are experiencing a liquidity constraint. We do not say our leaders have failed. We say there is a need for a structural realignment of the prevailing paradigms. We dress our calamities in the fine clothes of jargon, hoping that if we describe the disaster with enough syllables, it might lose its teeth. Mr. Hoover, God rest his weary, calculating soul, thought he was saving the world. He believed in the inherent reasonableness of men, a belief that I have always found to be the most dangerous form of delusion. He assumed that if you could get the right men in a room with the right charts and the right sense of duty, they would eventually do the right thing. He forgot that men in rooms, when pushed into a corner, are much more likely to do the spiteful thing, or the greedy thing, or the thing that makes them look best in the newspapers tomorrow. And so, the moratorium came into effect, a fragile, flickering candle in the gale. It offered a moment of respite, a tiny clearing in the woods where the wind didn't howl quite so loudly, but it did nothing to address the structural rot of the forest. The debts remained looming like the shadows of a giant, and the nations, having taken their short, frightened breath, returned to their positions with even greater intensity. There is a peculiar, pathetic dignity in the act of trying to manage the unmanageable, like the grandmother who attempts to hold back the tide with a lace handkerchief. Mr. Hoover's effort was doomed to failure, but it was a failure of the highest order. He had looked at the abyss and reached out a hand. It did not bridge the gap, and it did not stop the slide, but it remains one of the few instances in the year 1931 where anyone bothered to act as if we were all in some small, inconvenient way in the same boat. Of course, the boat was taking on water at a rate that would have made the Titanic blush, and the passengers were busy arguing over who had the right to sit in the captain's chair. But for a few weeks, the moratorium gave the world the illusion of order. It was a comforting lie, and in those lean, hungry times, a lie was often the only thing on the menu. The irony, of course, was that the more the nations agreed to the holiday on payments, the more they realized how much they truly hated the idea of being dependent on one another. The moratorium was meant to foster trust. Instead, it served only to confirm that trust was the one currency that was currently in shorter supply than gold. Each nation looked at the other, saw the pause in payment, and wondered who was going to be the first to break the seal and jump for the lifeboat. It was a brotherhood of distrust, a fraternity of the suspicious, held together by the thin, frayed rope of a treaty that everyone knew was written in disappearing ink. And so we stumbled on. The year moved forward, indifferent to our plans, our treaties, and our well-meaning doomed attempts at engineering a salvation. We learned that the world does not care for moratoriums. It moves to the beat of its own drum, and that drum was currently sounding a rhythm that was increasingly and uncomfortably like the march toward something much, much worse. We were, in 1931, a collection of men standing on a pier, throwing paper boats into a raging sea, and wondering with a sort of intellectual vanity why they did not stay afloat. We were not yet finished with our folly. Indeed, we were only just beginning to warm up to the task of dismantling the future, one polite, bureaucratic handshake at a time. Chapter 3. Britain leaves the gold. If you were to walk into a London counting house in the early months of 1931 and inquire, with the innocent curiosity of a rube at a country fair, what exactly is the gold standard? The banker would likely have looked at you with the same horrified pity one reserves for a child who has just asked if the moon is made of cheddar. He would have explained, with a tone of long-suffering patience, that the gold standard was the very foundation of civilization. It was the immutable law, the celestial axis upon which the world spun, the bedrock of all decency. It was, in short, the reason your trousers stayed up and the sun rose in the east. To suggest that a nation might simply walk away from its gold might effectively tell the world that its currency was no longer tethered to a hunk of yellow metal buried in a vault, was viewed by the respectable classes as a sort of financial blasphemy. It was the equivalent of a clergyman suggesting that the Ten Commandments were merely a set of loose suggestions for people who weren't particularly busy on a Sunday. But as 1931 dragged its tired, battered heels across the calendar, Britain, the grand, glorious, and occasionally exhausted proprietor of the global ledger, found that its anchor had become a lead weight. It was dragging the entire ship of state toward the bottom of the sea. The gold was supposed to be a stabilizer, a silent, glittering guarantor of value. Instead, it had become a shackle. While every other nation in the world was frantically trying to hoard its gold like a dragon in a cavern, Britain was watching its own supply bleed away, drop by agonizing drop, to pay for debts that seemed to grow larger the more one tried to satisfy them. The great and the good, the fellows in top hats who ran the Bank of England, with the stiff-lipped stoicism of men who had never been surprised by anything in their lives, began to sweat. They held secret meetings. They whispered in wood-paneled rooms that smelled of stale cigar smoke and centuries of accumulated confidence. They debated the sanctity of the pound. They argued that to abandon the gold was to abandon reality itself. It is a funny thing about humans. We are quite content to let reality be a bit inconvenient, provided we have a good theory to explain away the inconvenience. For years, the world had operated on the comfortable assumption that money was a thing, a physical, tangible reality. But by the autumn of 1931, the world was beginning to discover that money is not a thing at all. It is a collective hallucination. It is an agreement. It is a story we all tell one another, and we only continue to believe it so long as we are convinced that our neighbor also believes it. When the British government finally pulled the plug, it did so with a frantic, uncharacteristic haste. They did not announce it with the booming trumpets of empire. They did it like a thief in the night, hoping that if they moved quickly enough, they might reach the other side of the stream before the world realized the bridge had been burned behind them. On the 21st of September, the news went out. Britain was off the gold. The reaction was a mixture of absolute, unbridled terror and a strange, confused sense of relief. In the city of London, men who had spent their entire lives treating the pound sterling with the reverence due a holy relic suddenly found themselves holding a piece of paper that was worth, well, it was worth exactly what someone else was willing to trade for it. The magic had been stripped away. The gold was gone, and yet, and this was the part that truly rattled the foundations of the establishment, the sun still rose the next morning. The trains still ran, though they were rather late, as is their custom. The tea was still served at 4. The world watched in a state of suspended animation. If Britain, the very center of the global financial solar system, could simply decide that the metal in its vaults no longer mattered, what did that say about the rest of the world? It said that we were all living in a fool's paradise, and the fool had finally decided to check out of the hotel. Foreign investors, those sensitive, jittery creatures, did exactly what one would expect. They panicked. They viewed the departure from gold as a breach of contract, a betrayal of the highest order. They saw it as the ultimate proof that in the end, every man and every nation is only looking out for its own skin. And they were, of course, entirely correct. That is the tragedy of it. We spent a century preaching the virtues of international cooperation, of the global village, and of the interconnectedness of our destinies, only to have the whole structure collapse the moment the wind turned cold. The British public, meanwhile, was mostly baffled. The average man on the street saw the headlines about the devaluation of the pound and wondered if he would be able to afford a pint of bitter on Saturday night. He did not know that he was living through the death of an age. He did not realize that the era of the gentleman financier who navigated the world by the fixed star of gold was being replaced by the era of the bureaucrat who navigated by the shifting sands of politics and the printing press. What was most humorous, in a dark and cynical fashion, was the intellectual contortions of the experts. Before the event, they had spent months explaining why leaving gold was a physical impossibility, a violation of the laws of nature that would lead to instant chaos, darkness, and the end of civilization as we knew it. 2 days after it happened, those same experts were writing op-eds in the Times, explaining why, in fact, it was a stroke of absolute genius, a bold, visionary move that would allow the economy to breathe and recalibrate in ways that were previously unimaginable. It turns out that if you are a professional economist, there is no disaster so profound that you cannot frame it as an intentional strategy, provided you have a decent vocabulary and a sufficiently thick hide. They managed to convince the public that the floating pound was not a sinking boat, but a majestic, cloud-borne vessel, free from the heavy, suffocating drag of the past. The tragedy of the gold standard was that it required as its primary ingredient a level of honesty and stability that the human species has rarely possessed. We are not designed for fixed anchors. We are restless, grasping, and impulsive. We like to build empires and then realize we cannot afford them. We like to wage wars and then figure out how to pay for them by creating money out of thin air. Gold was a constraint. It was a referee that kept blowing the whistle every time we tried to cheat. Naturally, we grew to despise the referee. So, when Britain stepped off the ledge, they were not just abandoning a medal. They were abandoning a promise. They were admitting that the world was too messy, too complex, and too deeply in debt to be governed by the cold, impartial laws of nature. They were entering a new era, an era of managed currencies, of political whim, and of the dangerous belief that we can legislate prosperity into existence. As 1931 ticked forward, the rest of the world looked at Britain and realized the game had changed. The anchor was up. The ship was adrift. We were no longer navigating by the stars. We were navigating by the flickering, unreliable glow of our own inventions. It was a terrifying thought for any sensible man, but the governments of the earth, in their infinite wisdom, simply declared that the water was fine and kept on sailing even as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy, with the promise of a long, cold night. They had traded the gold in the vault for the illusion of control, and for the moment that seemed like a bargain worth making, though it was a debt that would surely come due with interest before the decade was out. Chapter 4. The Mukden Incident. There is an old saying among the folks who haunt the frontier, or what passes for a frontier these days, which is usually just a place where someone has decided to park a train, that if you leave a pile of lumber in the woods long enough, it will eventually organize itself into a claim. In Manchuria, in the autumn of 1931, the Imperial Japanese Army decided to take this philosophy a step further. They decided that if you leave a piece of railroad track lying in the dirt, It will eventually, through some mysterious mechanical alchemy, organize itself into a full-scale invasion. It is a charming fiction, really. The notion that a railway line can simply decide to relocate itself, or that a few loose bolts could be considered an act of war, is the sort of logic that would make a Mississippi riverboat gambler blush with envy. The Mukden Incident, as the historians, those dry, dusty creatures who love to wrap tragedy in the thin, transparent paper of jargon, call it, was a masterpiece of manufactured grievance. It was a play performed in 3 acts with no audience, but with a great deal of ammunition. On the night of September 18th, a small section of track near Mukden was indeed damaged by an explosion. Whether the explosion was the work of a disgruntled revolutionary, a clumsy maintenance worker with a grudge against iron, or simply a railway line that had grown tired of the monotonous commute, remains a subject of some debate. However, the Imperial Japanese Army, an organization that has never been accused of lacking imagination, knew exactly who to blame. They blamed the Chinese. They blamed them with the practiced certainty of a man who has already rehearsed his speech in the mirror for a week. Now, it is worth noting that the Japanese garrison was already standing at attention, bayonets fixed and eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for a signal. They were like a pack of hounds waiting for the master to blow the whistle, except the hounds were armed with artillery, and the master was, apparently, a loose rail. The blast had barely echoed off the hills of Manchuria before the troops were in motion, sweeping across the countryside with the relentless, unthinking momentum of a flood. It was a brilliant piece of theater. The army didn't just walk into Manchuria. It marched in, wearing the heavy iron-shod boots of self-defense. They claimed they were merely protecting their investments, that long, thin ribbon of steel that connected the Orient to their own ambitions. It is a curious truth of human nature that we are always at our most aggressive when we claim to be protecting something. You will rarely find a man more dangerous than one who is convinced that his property rights are being threatened by a neighbor's breath. The world, sitting thousands of miles away in comfortable armchairs, watched the unfolding drama with a sense of confused detachment. The League of Nations, that grand experiment in global hand-wringing, began to vibrate. They formed committees. They issued resolutions. They wrote long, strongly worded letters that were likely used by the Japanese soldiers to light their evening campfires. It was a performance that would have been funny had the stakes not been the sovereignty of a nation and the lives of a few million people who hadn't asked for the privilege of being a footnote in an imperial expansion. One has to admire, in a cold and detached fashion, the audacity of the thing. The Japanese officers didn't wait for permission from Tokyo, nor did they wait for a formal declaration of war. They simply decided that the situation required a solution, and they proceeded to implement it with the kind of brisk administrative efficiency usually reserved for cleaning out a desk. They moved through Manchuria as if they were performing a public service, clearing the brush, putting down the disorder, and establishing a new, enlightened order, an order that just happened to involve them owning everything in sight. The local Chinese authorities, caught between the hammer of the Japanese advance and the anvil of their own fractured government, found themselves in a position that was both tragic and utterly predictable. They were like a man trying to stop a blizzard with an umbrella. They appealed to the world for help, but the world was currently busy trying to figure out if it was still on the gold standard or if it had hallucinated the whole thing. The great powers were preoccupied with their own internal wobbles, and they couldn't be bothered to notice a few miles of track disappearing in the middle of nowhere. It is a recurring theme in the history of the human race, the tragedy of the forgotten frontier. We always assume that what happens in the remote corners of the world stays in the remote corners of the world, forgetting that a fire started in the brush is perfectly capable of wandering into the barn and burning down the entire farm. The Mukden Incident was not merely a local scuffle, it was a crack in the dam. It was the first loud, unmistakable sound of the international order beginning to splinter. The Japanese narrative of the event was a work of art. They painted themselves as the aggrieved party, the victims of a chaotic and unruly neighbor who had dared to disrupt the flow of commerce. They spoke of stability and mutual prosperity, with the earnest sincerity of a fox explaining to the farmer why he was doing the chickens a favor by thinning their ranks. It is amazing what a man can justify to himself if he uses the right vocabulary. If you call a conquest a development, if you call a massacre an adjustment, and if you call a land grab a security measure, you can sleep soundly at night, provided you don't dream of broken rail ties. The tragedy of the Mukden Incident was that it proved that an army, if it is sufficiently organized and sufficiently indifferent to the truth, can create its own reality. They didn't need a justification that made sense. They only needed one that was loud enough to silence the opposition. And in 1931, the world was remarkably quiet. It was a year of exhaustion, a year of inward-looking desperation, a year where everyone was too busy counting their own pennies to notice the sound of boots marching in the east. As the army settled into the territory, the world watched and waited for the proper authorities to do something. But the authorities were merely a collection of names on a piece of paper, and the paper was currently being blown about by the very winds of change that they were trying to ignore. It was a dark, cynical time, a time when the strong didn't just prey on the weak. They explained at length why the weak were actually benefiting from the experience. So the track in Mukden was repaired, the army stayed, and the history books were rewritten to suggest that it had all been inevitable. The world moved on, a little more cynical, a little more fearful, and a little more aware that the rules of the international community were, in fact, only suggestions, and that the strongest argument in any debate is generally the one delivered by a man with a cannon. It was a sobering lesson, a grim, mechanical reality, and it served as a dark prologue to the decade that was to follow. We were, all of us, standing on the same track, watching the same train coming, and pretending that it was only there to deliver the morning post. Chapter 5. The Spanish Republic Rises. There is nothing quite as melancholy as a crown that has lost its luster, unless it is the head of the man who is trying to keep it on. In the spring of 1931, King Alfonso XIII of Spain found himself in the position of a man who has been invited to a banquet he didn't organize, only to discover that the other guests are entirely tired of his presence and would very much like him to pay for the wine before he departs. Spain, that ancient and sun-drenched land of chivalry, windmills, and enough history to crush a smaller nation, had been simmering for some time. It was a pot of boiling pride, spiked with a generous helping of frustration and a garnish of parliamentary incompetence. For years, the monarchy had been the sturdy, if somewhat rickety chair upon which the Spanish state sat. But by April, the chair was missing a leg, the upholstery was frayed, and the people had decided they would rather sit on the floor, thank you very much, provided the floor was their own. King Alfonso, a man who had been born with the weight of the past upon his shoulders and a penchant for gambling on the future, watched the municipal elections of April with the nervous flutter of a man who suspects the cards are stacked. He was a Bourbon, a line known for its ability to learn nothing and forget nothing, and he possessed the peculiar royal delusion that his subjects were merely children who would eventually return to the nursery once they had finished their little tantrum. But the electorate, that unpredictable beast, had decided that the nursery was closed. When the votes were counted, it turned out that the cities, those bastions of loud voices and new ideas, had voted overwhelmingly for the Republic. It was not a violent uprising, not a storming of the Bastille with pitchforks and fire. It was, rather, a polite, firm, and undeniably awkward realization that the monarchy had simply ceased to be a useful habit. One has to admire the theatricality of it. The king, realizing that his subjects were no longer in the mood for majesty, did not put up a fight. He did not call the cavalry, nor did he barricade himself in the palace with the royal plate and a supply of sherry. He did something that was, in its own way, the most sensible thing a monarch can do when the wind changes. He packed his bags. It is a curious thing about power. It is an illusion that relies entirely on the audience's willingness to suspend their disbelief. For centuries, the Spaniards had suspended it beautifully. They had treated the king as the embodiment of the nation, the living link to the glory of the past. But in 1931, the audience walked out of the theater. They simply stopped believing in the play. And when the audience stops believing, the actor is left standing on the stage in his tights and crown, feeling dreadfully foolish as the janitor begins to sweep up the popcorn around his feet. Alfonso left for exile, trading the throne for the quiet, undistinguished life of a private citizen. He left behind a country that was, at once, electrified and terrified. The proclamation of the Second Spanish Republic was met with a joyous, chaotic explosion of spirit. People danced in the streets, hung bunting from the balconies, and spoke of a new era of justice, education, and progress. It was a spring fever of the soul, a time when it seemed that all the old suffocating constraints of the past had been dissolved by the stroke of a pen. But, as any man who has ever tried to paint a house while the wind is blowing knows, the excitement of the start is rarely matched by the practicalities of the finish. The new republic, composed of idealists, intellectuals, and a fair share of professional agitators, looked at the Spanish state and realized that it was a pile of broken parts held together by tradition. Now that the tradition was gone, the parts were beginning to slide. The republic was a grand, noble experiment in democracy, the sort of thing that makes a man feel proud to be part of the human race. They wanted to build a land where the peasant had a school, where the church had its place, but not the keys to the treasury, and where the law was something more than a tool for the powerful. It was a beautiful vision, as clear and sharp as a mountain stream. The only problem was the terrain. The terrain of Spain is a rocky, difficult landscape, and the social terrain was even worse. There were the conservatives who looked at the Republic and saw the end of everything decent, holy, and orderly. There were the anarchists who looked at the Republic and saw merely a new, slightly different shade of oppression. There were the regionalists who wanted to be Spain, but wanted to be themselves too, which is a condition that usually leads to a great deal of shouting and very little agreement. The Republic, in its enthusiasm, tried to do everything at once. It tried to build a paradise in a week. It set about rewriting the rules of the land, the church, and the army with the vigor of a man trying to fix a leak in a dam by throwing bricks at it. The conservatives were appalled, the radicals were impatient, and the ordinary fellow, the one who just wanted to know if the bread would be cheaper and the taxes lower, looked at the shouting in the Parliament and wondered if they hadn't traded a quiet king for a very loud set of problems. There is a distinct, dark humor in the way we choose our leaders. We seek out the loudest talkers, the most convinced men, the ones who promise us that the sky will change color if only we follow their specific, patented brand of wisdom. And then, once they are in power, we are shocked to discover that they are just as confused, petty, and fallible as the rest of us. The Republic had the misfortune of being born into a world that was already stumbling. It was 1931, the year the global floorboards were groaning, and Spain was just another building in a city that was experiencing a seismic shift. The idealism of the new leaders was pitted against the grinding, indifferent machinery of the Great Depression, which cared as little for a republic as it did for a king. Alfonso, in his exile, must have looked back at his country with a mixture of bitterness and relief. He had been spared the burden of trying to solve the unsolvable. He had left the stage before the building caught fire. There is a certain kind of genius in knowing when to exit, even if the exit is prompted by a lack of volunteers to defend your door. The rise of the Spanish Republic was a moment of profound human hope. It was a reminder that we are capable of imagining a better world, of reaching for a higher standard of living than the one we were born into. But it was also a warning, a reminder that a change of name is not a change of heart, and that a house built on the shifting sands of conflicting ideals is a house that will always be in danger of sliding into the sea. As the year progressed, the music in the streets of Madrid began to fade, replaced by the sharpening of knives and the hardening of hearts. The Republic had its day in the sun, and it was a brilliant, shining day. But the shadows were already lengthening, and the dreamers were beginning to realize that the work of governing is much harder than the work of cheering for a new flag. It was a story as old as the hills, the story of a people who wanted to be free, and of the agonizing, messy, and often tragic discovery that freedom is not a gift you receive, but a burden you have to carry day after day through the dust and the heat without ever being quite sure if you are headed in the right direction. Chapter 6. The Statute of Westminster. There is a particular kind of logic that the British Empire employed for centuries, a logic which held that if you were sufficiently polite, sufficiently dressed in khaki, and sufficiently firm about the importance of tea time, you could govern half the planet without ever actually having to ask anyone what they thought about the matter. It was a marvelous system, built on the sturdy assumption that the colonies were merely children who had not yet reached the age of reason. But by 1931, the children had grown quite large, had developed their own bank accounts, and were beginning to suggest, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, that they might like to sit at the head of the table for a change. The British government, a collection of gentlemen who were generally more comfortable with a well-drafted contract than a genuine argument, decided that the best way to handle this burgeoning independence was to codify it. They produced a document called the Statute of Westminster, which is one of the most British things ever invented. It was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering that managed to grant everyone exactly what they wanted while ensuring that absolutely nothing, at least in the short term, actually changed. It was essentially a polite bureaucratic way of saying, you are now free to run your own house, provided you still agree to send us a Christmas card and keep buying our tea. The statute was an admission of a reality that the empire had spent decades trying to ignore, that you cannot hold the world together with a handshake and a stiff upper lip if the other person is busy deciding they don't much care for your grip. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, the grown-up children of the family, were all clamoring for the right to be, well, themselves. They wanted their own laws, their own voices, and their own ability to say no to the occasional imperial edict that didn't quite suit their local climate. To read the debates in Parliament regarding the statute is to witness a theater of the absurd. There were members of the House of Lords who looked upon the prospect of self-governing dominions with the same horror one might reserve for a child, suggesting he should be allowed to juggle butcher knives. They argued that if the empire were to loosen its tether, the whole thing would fly apart like a badly tied bundle of firewood. They spoke of the fragility of the Commonwealth and the unifying power of the Crown, as if the entire global connection were held together by nothing more than the sturdy glue of royal tradition. And to be fair, they were half right. The empire was held together by tradition, but tradition is a fragile thing when it comes into contact with the cold, hard reality of economics. The Statute of Westminster was less a philosophical conversion and more an accounting necessity. The empire had realized that it was becoming terribly expensive to be everyone's parent. It was far cheaper and infinitely more convenient to allow the children to buy their own groceries and maintain their own kitchens. The document itself is a marvel of legal prose, written with the sort of precision that is meant to put a man to sleep before he realizes he's just signed away his influence. It declared that the parliaments of the dominions were sovereign, a word that sounds very grand and very important, like a title on a dusty spine in a library. It granted them the power to make their own laws without the meddlesome interference of London. It was, in effect, the formal divorce proceedings of the empire, handled with the utmost civility, over cucumber sandwiches, in a room that smelled of floor wax and centuries of moral certainty. One can hardly blame the British for this sudden outburst of liberalism. When you find yourself in 1931, watching your currency wobble, your economy contract, and your international influence being questioned by every upstart nation with a printing press, you are prone to looking for ways to lighten the load. The empire had been carrying the world on its shoulders for a long time, and the weight was beginning to cause a bit of a crick in the neck. The irony, of course, was that while Britain was busy granting independence on paper, the world was becoming, in practice, more interconnected and more dependent than ever. They were busy signing treaties of autonomy just as the global economy was revealing that we were all, quite literally, on the same sinking ship. It is the classic human maneuver. We spend years arguing about the shape of the lifeboats while the water is already lapping at our ankles. The folks in the Dominions, the Australians, the Canadians, the rest of them, greeted the news with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has finally been given the keys to his own flat. They didn't declare war, they didn't burn the Union Jack, and they didn't stop being part of the family. They simply wanted the assurance that, should the family business go bankrupt, they wouldn't be held liable for the debts of their cousins in London. It was a matter of prudence, a matter of pride, and a matter of realizing that the 20th century was not going to be a simple continuation of the 19th. The Statute of Westminster serves as a perfect example of how history likes to disguise its revolutions as paperwork. We tell ourselves that things are changing because of big dramatic events: the fall of a throne, the march of an army, the crash of a market. But often, the real change happens in a back room, with a pen, a bottle of ink, and a group of men who are desperately trying to make the future look like a slightly more updated version of the past. They didn't want the empire to end. They just wanted to reorganize the management structure so that it might survive the storm. It was a noble, if somewhat futile, attempt to legislate order into a world that was clearly determined to embrace chaos. They were trying to create a commonwealth of nations, a group of equal partners who would move forward in a spirit of cooperation and mutual benefit. It is a beautiful thought, and in the hands of the right men, it might have worked. But the world of 1931 was not a place that rewarded mutual benefit. It was a place that rewarded strength, suspicion, and a very sharp eye for the main chance. As the ink dried on the statute, the British politicians patted themselves on the back, satisfied that they had preserved the essence of the empire while yielding to the necessities of the age. They had bought themselves some time, they had appeased the restless children, and they had kept the tea flowing. It was a victory of a sort, but it was a victory on the deck of a ship that was currently listing heavily to port. We look back at these grand legal declarations and we marvel at the arrogance of the men who thought they could bind the future with words. We think, if only they had known what was coming, if only they had realized that the world was about to be turned upside down. But that is the folly of the historian. The men in 1931 didn't know the future. They only knew the present, and the present was a mess that needed cleaning up. And so they cleaned it up, with all the grace and elegance of a group of men trying to arrange the deck chairs while the storm clouds gathered, dark, ominous, and utterly indifferent to the importance of the document they had just signed. It is a grand, funny, and deeply tragic spectacle, this human urge to write a rule book for a game that everyone else has already decided to stop playing. Chapter 7. The Empire State Opens. From the very moment our earliest ancestor crawled out of the swamp, looked up at a mountain, and decided he would much rather be at the top of it than at the bottom, humanity has been afflicted with a persistent, incurable itch to get off the ground. We have tried ladders, we have tried balloons, and we have tried the shaky wings of various feathered contraptions that generally resulted in a sudden, damp thud in a pasture. But it was not until the spring of 1931 that the human race finally succeeded in building a monument to its own vanity so tall that it could look down upon the clouds with the smug satisfaction of a landlord reviewing his tenants. On the first day of May, the Empire State Building opened its doors in New York City. It was a soaring needle of steel, limestone, and unmitigated audacity that pierced the sky like a giant exclamation point at the end of a sentence nobody was quite sure how to finish. It stood more than 1,000 feet above the pavement, a quarter-mile of solid ambition piled neatly upon a plot of land that had once been a farm for peaceable cows. To witness the opening was to witness a spectacle of the highest American order, which is to say, it was loud, expensive, and carried out with the absolute certainty that the universe was thoroughly impressed by the performance. Down in Washington, President Hoover, who, as we have already seen, spent most of his year trying to legislate the global weather, pressed a shiny button that sent an electrical current leaping through hundreds of miles of wire to turn on the lights in the grand lobby. It was a marvelous triumph of modern science. With the flick of a finger, a man in a waistcoat 300 miles away could illuminate a marble hallway in Manhattan, though he remained entirely powerless to illuminate the minds of his own cabinet. The construction of this mountain of metal had been a race of pure, unadulterated spite. For months, the builders of New York had been behaving like schoolboys arguing over the length of their fishing rods. Walter Chrysler had built his own tower, hiding a shiny steel spire inside the roof like a card up a gambler's sleeve, only to pop it out at the last moment to claim the title of the tallest building in the world. But John J. Raskob and his associates looked at that spire and decided that they would not be outdone by a man who made his living selling automobiles. They hired an army of workers, ordered mountains of stone, and set about building a structure that would make the Chrysler Tower look like a picket fence. The fellows who actually put the thing together were a race apart. They were Mohawk iron workers and European immigrants who walked along the naked steel girders 1,000 feet in the air with the casual indifference of a cat strolling along a garden wall. They caught red-hot rivets in tin buckets while the wind howled around their ears, with nothing between their boots and the stone sidewalks below but a long, beautiful view and several seconds of terrifying realization should they lose their footing. They built the entire thing in just over a year, a feat of mechanical discipline that would have been magnificent if the world had actually required the space they were creating. For that was the grand, quiet joke that sat at the heart of the Empire State Building. It was a cathedral of commerce, built at a moment when commerce had decided to take an indefinite vacation. The elevators were capable of carrying thousands of people an hour to the upper reaches of the sky. But when the doors slid open, they revealed nothing but vast, echoing deserts of empty plaster and unrented linoleum. You could have fired a double-barreled shotgun down the corridors of the 50th floor and hit nothing more substantial than a disappointed leasing agent or a wandering ghost of the late boom market. The public quickly dubbed it the Empty State Building, a name delivered with that peculiar sharp-edged wit that New Yorkers use to keep from weeping into their soup. It was a vertical wilderness. The owners tried everything short of kidnapping to fill the offices. But in 1931, a business leader who had enough money to rent a whole floor in a skyscraper was about as common as a unicorn in a blacksmith shop. Most corporations were currently busy trying to compress themselves into the size of a cigar box, just to keep the lights on. And so the great tower stood there, a beautiful, silver-trimmed paradox. If you stood on the observation deck on a clear afternoon, you could look out across the harbor, past the Statue of Liberty, and see the whole world spreading out toward the horizon like a map. It was a view that made a man feel like a god, or at least like a very important stockholder in the universe, but if you turned your gaze downward, if you leaned over the parapet and looked through the telescopes at the streets directly below, the view became considerably less majestic. There, nestled in the long, cold shadow of the world's tallest building, were the bread lines. They stretched around the blocks like long, gray serpents, composed of men in woolen caps and threadbare overcoats, standing patiently in the damp air for the privilege of a cup of coffee and a roll. It was a sight that would have baffled any sensible visitor from Mars. Here was a civilization that could tame gravity, that could roll out structural steel like pie crust, and that could build an artificial mountain in 12 months. Yet it could not, for the life of it, figure out how to get a loaf of bread from the bakery into the stomach of a hungry bricklayer. It was the ultimate ledger of 1931, written in stone and bread. The tower represented everything we thought we were: progressive, unstoppable, and infinitely clever. The line on the sidewalk represented everything we actually were at that moment: confused, broke, and deeply suspicious that the fellows running the show had lost the instruction manual. The contrast was enough to make a philosopher take up drinking, or a drinker take up philosophy. The rich folk and the tourists paid their coins to ride the lightning-fast elevators to the top, where they could buy souvenirs and marvel at the engineering marvel of the age. And when they came back down, they walked past the men who had built the very roads they were driving on, men who were now reduced to selling apples on the street corners for 5 cents apiece. The apples were shiny and red, and the men who sold them were often remarkably polite, carrying themselves with a dignity that the market had not yet managed to completely bankrupt. It is a grand truth of our species that we are always much better at the big dramatic gestures than we are at the quiet, necessary chores. We would much rather build a pyramid to the stars than fix the plumbing in the cellar. The Empire State Building was our pyramid, a glorious, shining proof that even when we are sliding down the bank into the creek, we like to do it with our hats on and our flags flying. It was a monument to tomorrow, built in a yesterday that had gone sour, standing as a reminder that no matter how high a man climbs, he still has to come down eventually to see about his dinner. Chapter 8. The Sweep of the Radio. In the days of my youth, if a catastrophe occurred on the other side of the globe, say a minor revolution in a banana republic, or a sudden damp collapse of a dynasty in the Orient, the news of it had to travel by sail, by steam, and occasionally by a mule that was entirely indifferent to the frantic march of human history. By the time the tidings reached a man's front porch in Missouri, the event was already ancient history. The dead had been comfortably buried. The new rulers had already grown corrupt and fat, and the man reading the print could digest the whole matter along with his morning coffee without a single flutter of his pulse. It was a grand, slow world that allowed a fellow plenty of time to brace his feet before the next wave of worldly trouble broke over his head. But by the year of our Lord 1931, humanity had succeeded in stringing the very atmosphere with an invisible web of electrical nerves, thanks to the restless tinkering of Signor Marconi and a cohort of short-sleeved wizards who had figured out how to harness the ether. The result of this supreme technical triumph was that no civilized person was ever entirely free from a sense of impending gloom again. The wireless had ceased to be a curious toy for wealthy eccentrics or a convenient method for shipwrecked captains to signal their distress to the fishes. It had become an absolute domestic tyrant, an oracle that set itself up on the parlor table and demanded the undivided attention of the entire household. To look upon the standard radio receiver of 1931 was to look upon an object that seemed to have been designed by a committee consisting of an architect of Gothic cathedrals and a manufacturer of sewing machines. It was a neat, arched cabinet of polished walnut or mahogany, looking for all the world like a miniature church that had been shrunk by a magician and equipped with 3 or 4 dark, mysterious knobs. Behind its cloth-covered grill sat a collection of vacuum tubes that glowed with a faint, demonic light, warming the air with the smell of hot bakelite and dust. It was an altar erected in the corner of the living room, and the gospel it preached was one of instantaneous, unvarnished reality. The sheer whim of the thing was what caught a man's fancy. You sat in your armchair, gave a little turn to a dial no larger than a pocket watch, and through the static and the whistling of the cosmic winds came a voice from 300 miles away, clear as a bell and twice as loud. It might be a fellow in New York telling you about the weather, or a lady in Chicago singing a song about her broken heart, or a solemn gentleman in Washington explaining that while the nation's treasury was currently as empty as a dry well, there was every reason to believe that a great bucket of prosperity was about to be lowered into it from above. The paradox of the radio in 1931 was a matter that would have puzzled any angel sent down to audit the accounts of the human race. The world was undeniably spectacularly broke. Men were patching their boots with cardboard. Women were stretching a single chicken over a week's worth of dinners, and the banks were locking their doors with the rhythmic regularity of a clock ticking. Yet, despite this great vacuum in the public purse, the factories could hardly turn out the wireless sets fast enough to satisfy the demand. A family might be 3 months behind on the rent. Their car might be up on blocks in the yard for lack of gasoline, and the cat might be looking thin. But by George, they would find the dollars necessary to keep the radio playing. It was the ultimate escape hatch from the gray, heavy landscape of the times, but it was an escape hatch that possessed a most malicious habit of piping in the very noise of the world breaking down outside. You tuned in to forget that your shop had failed or that your salary had been cut by half, only to be greeted by an announcer who informed you with an alarming amount of cheerfulness that the unemployment figures had just broken another record, or that a great fire was currently consuming the docks of Hamburg. The radio did not merely deliver the news, it threw it into your lap while you were sitting in your slippers, forcing you to participate in the general misery of mankind before you had even had a chance to check your own traps. And then, of course, there were the advertisers, those ingenious, cold-blooded pirates of the airwaves who had discovered that if you could get a man to listen to a beautiful violin solo, you could easily slide a brief lecture on the virtues of a particular brand of laundry soap under his guard before he had the presence of mind to reach for the switch. The air was suddenly full of disembodied spirits who were deeply concerned with the condition of your teeth, the state of your digestion, and the specific variety of tobacco you chose to stuff into your pipe. They spoke with the earnest, pleading urgency of a friend who has stayed up all night worrying about your welfare, though their affection was strictly contingent upon your willingness to part with a nickel at the corner store. The family circle, which had once been a place for the reading of books, the playing of checkers, or the quiet, traditional exchange of local gossip, was utterly transformed by the sweep of the wireless. In the evenings, the lights would be turned low, partly to save on the electric bill and partly to enhance the solemnity of the occasion, and the family would gather around the glowing box like a tribe of savages around a campfire. They did not look at one another. They stared blankly at the speaker cloth, their faces illuminated by the faint orange light of the tubes, their minds floating away on the waves of the ether. If a child dared to speak, or if the dog barked at a passing shadow, they were instantly hushed with the fierce collective indignation usually reserved for a fellow who coughs during the climax of a Sunday sermon. It was a magnificent piece of humbug, this belief that because we could hear a man talking in Denver, we were somehow wiser than our fathers who had only heard the talk of the blacksmith and the parson. The radio gave us the illusion of omnipresence. It made us feel as if we were sitting in the front row of history, watching the great machine turn. But the machine was turning out a very rough sort of fabric in 1931, and the more we heard of it, the more we began to suspect that the engineers had lost the blueprint and were merely throwing random levers to see what would happen next. Still, the music played on. Through the static of the summer storms came the rhythms of the jazz bands, the sweet, melancholy strains of the crooners, and the grand, booming thunder of the symphony orchestras. It was a strange, beautiful contrast. The world outside shivering in the rain, while the air inside was thick with the artificial sunshine of Hollywood and Broadway. We were a generation of dreamers who had figured out a way to live two lives at once, one on the cold, hard pavement of reality, and one in the warm, tuneful wilderness of the wireless. It was a grand, funny, and deeply human spectacle, and as the year rolled on toward its conclusion, the little wooden churches in our parlors kept on singing, keeping our spirits just far enough above the water to ensure we would be ready to stumble into whatever foolishness the next 12 months had in store for us. Chapter 9. The Introduction of the Frozen Pea. Nature has ever been a stern schoolmistress, but upon no point has she been more unyielding than the calendar. For a few brief, glorious months in the summer, she flings open her larders and permits the human race to gorge itself upon things that are green, crisp, and bursting with the sweet juices of the earth. A man may walk into his garden in July, pluck a pea from the vine, and pop it into his mouth with the absolute certainty that he is tasting the very thoughts of the Creator. But the moment the first frost hits, the curtain comes down with a sudden icy thud, and for the next 6 months the family table is reduced to a gray, melancholy procession of salted pork, withered potatoes, and that most depressing of all horticultural specimens, the winter turnip. To chew upon a turnip in the dark days of January is to understand the true depth of human misery. It is a vegetable that possesses neither wit nor ambition, tasting chiefly of cold dirt and forgotten promises. For centuries, our ancestors accepted this seasonal exile with a stoic resignation, knowing that if they wished to survive until the robins returned, they must reconcile themselves to a diet that had all the culinary charm of an old boot. They dried their corn, they pickled their cabbage, and they salted their beef until it was as hard as oak, and they thanked Providence that they were not entirely starved before the spring thaw. Then came the tin can, an invention that was hailed as a magnificent triumph of human ingenuity. It was a device that allowed a man to trap a tomato or a string bean inside a metal cylinder, where it would remain in a state of suspended animation until someone came along with a cold chisel to rescue it. But the tin can, for all its convenience, was a deceptive savior. A pea that had spent 6 months lounging in a bath of salty brine inside a lead-sealed container was no longer the proud, sweet sphere it had been upon the vine. It emerged from its tomb looking pale, wrinkled, and thoroughly discouraged, possessing a texture that was alarmingly similar to library paste and a flavor that suggested it had been harvested in the vicinity of a blacksmith shop. It was against this background of culinary stagnation that a gentleman with the remarkably prophetic name of Clarence Birdseye stepped onto the stage of history. Mr. Birdseye was an American eccentric of the highest caliber, which is to say, he was a man who could not look at a natural law without instantly wondering if he couldn't find a way to circumvent it for a profit. In the years before the Great War, he had found himself up in the frozen wastes of Labrador, working as a fur trader and observing the habits of the local inhabitants with the sharp, inquisitive eye of a natural philosopher. It was there, while watching the native fishermen pull their catch from holes in the ice, that Mr. Birdseye received his revelation. He noticed that when a fish was yanked out of the water into a gale that was blowing at 50 degrees below zero, it did not merely freeze, it froze instantly. It became as hard as a cobblestone before it had even had time to realize it was no longer in the ocean. Weeks later, when the fish was thrown into a bucket of water to thaw, Mr. Birdseye discovered to his astonishment that it did not turn into the soft, slimy mush that usually resulted from the freezing of food back home. It was as fresh, firm, and flavorful as if it had been caught that very morning. Now, a lesser man would have simply eaten his dinner and thanked his stars for a good meal in a cold country. But Mr. Birdseye possessed that peculiar mechanical type of mind that cannot rest until it has turned a miracle of nature into a factory process. He set about investigating the matter with the relentless industry of a terrier after a rat. He discovered that the whole secret lay in the speed of the frost. When you freeze a vegetable or a piece of meat slowly, as folks had been doing in their ice boxes for generations, the water inside the cells expands into large, jagged crystals of ice. These crystals act like tiny knives, ripping the delicate walls of the food to ribbons from the inside out. When the thaw comes, the structural integrity of the object is entirely gone, and you are left with nothing but a damp, unappetizing ruin. But when you freeze the food with the sudden, catastrophic violence of a Labrador winter, the ice crystals have no time to grow. They remain tiny, harmless specks that leave the cells of the vegetable completely uninjured. The summer is trapped inside the ice before it has a chance to pack its bags. By the time 1931 rolled around, Mr. Birdseye had perfected his apparatus, a monstrous clanking contrivance that used metal plates cooled by chemical brine to deliver a frost so sudden and profound that it would have made a polar bear shiver. He called his creation Frosted Foods, and he set about convincing the American public that they could now purchase the month of June in a waxed paper carton at the corner grocery store. The introduction of the frozen pea to the general market was a comedy of cross purposes that would have delighted any student of human folly. The public, having been burned before by the empty promises of various scientific foods, looked upon the little green boxes with a deep and abiding suspicion. A housewife who had spent her life judging the quality of her vegetables by their smell and the snap of their pods, was entirely baffled by an object that was as hard as a brick and cold enough to take the skin off her fingers. To ask her to believe that this icy lump would, after a few minutes in a saucepan, transform itself into a dish of sweet, tender peas was like asking her to believe that a wooden footstool could be coaxed into blooming like a rose. Furthermore, the grocery stores themselves were entirely unequipped for the revolution. A shopkeeper who was accustomed to keeping his stock in a burlap sack or a wooden crate looked at Mr. Birdseye's products and realized he would have to purchase a special, heavily insulated cabinet that could maintain a temperature of 0 degrees inside his establishment. In 1931, when most grocers were wondering if they would have enough cash in the till to pay the milkman on Tuesday, the prospect of investing a small fortune in an artificial glacier just to sell a few boxes of frozen greens was viewed as a species of commercial madness. Yet, despite the skepticism of the rubes, the suspicion of the housewives, and the general breakdown of the financial machinery of the world, the frozen pea began its steady, relentless march across the American plate. It was a triumph of the mechanical spirit over the seasons, a proof that if you give an American engineer enough pipes, pumps, and ammonia, he can manufacture a summer afternoon in the middle of a blizzard. There was, of course, a grand whimsical irony in the timing of the thing. The year 1931 was a period when the great structures of human society were revealing themselves to be thoroughly fragile. The banks were melting like ice in the sun, the empires were creaking at the joints, and the political leaders were running about like chickens in a thunderstorms, entirely powerless to stop the general drift toward ruin. Yet, at that very moment, science had succeeded in rendering a single, insignificant vegetable entirely immortal. A man might lose his job, his house, and his savings in the course of a Tuesday morning, but when he sat down to his dinner that evening, he could console himself with the knowledge that his peas were of a uniform greenness and a crispness that would have been impossible for his grandfather to achieve even with the assistance of an army of gardeners. We had succeeded in domesticating the frost, turning the ancient terror of the North into a convenient kitchen servant. We had severed our relationship with the land, ensuring that henceforth the city dweller could live in a state of perpetual ignorance regarding the rotation of crops or the behavior of the clouds. It was a magnificent achievement, but like all our achievements, it left us just a little more dependent upon the machine than we had been before. We had traded the turnip for the frozen pea, and while our palates were undoubtedly the better for the bargain, our souls were left to wonder what other surprises the fellows with the thermometers were planning to unleash upon us before the winter was through. Chapter 10. The Rise of the Gangster Biopic. Now, a human being is a most curious piece of machinery, constructed with a collection of gears and springs that seem designed to work at cross purposes with one another. If you observe him in his natural habitat, which is usually a place where he is trying to look more respectable than his neighbors, he will tell you that he holds the law in the highest esteem. He will declare, with a hand upon his heart and a tear in his eye, that honesty is the only policy, that righteousness is its own reward, and that a fellow who takes what does not belong to him deserves nothing better than a diet of bread and water behind a row of stout iron bars. Yet, if you take that same moral gentleman, place him in a darkened theater with a sack of buttered corn in his lap, and flick on a machine that projects the image of a thoroughly unprincipled scoundrel upon a bedsheet, a remarkable transformation occurs. The gentleman's eye brightens, his pulse quickens, and his heart begins to root for the scoundrel with a frantic enthusiasm that would look entirely out of place in a church pew. He does not wish to see the rogue reformed. He wishes to see him outrun the police, outwit the district attorney, and purchase a brand new Packard with the proceeds of his last bank robbery. In the long gray year of 1931, the Wizards of Hollywood, a town populated chiefly by folks who had discovered that you could make far more money by manufacturing illusions than by growing oranges, made a grand and highly profitable discovery. They realized that while the American public was undeniably spectacularly poor, they were remarkably fond of watching other people break the law in style. The drawing-room comedies of the previous decade, featuring pale dukes and ladies who spent 3 hours deciding whether or not to take sugar in their tea, were suddenly tossed into the ash heap. The public didn't want etiquette. They wanted excitement. They wanted the rattle of the machine gun, the screech of tires on asphalt, and the sharp, snapping dialogue of men who had never learned their manners, but knew exactly how to handle a revolver. This sudden turn toward the underworld produced a new species of entertainment, the Gangster Biopic. It was a masterpiece of commercial hypocrisy, presented with a wink and a nod that would have done credit to a Mississippi riverboat gambler. The studio bosses, being God-fearing men who were deeply concerned about the opinions of various local censorship boards, always took care to place a solemn little notice at the beginning or the end of the picture. This notice informed the audience in the loftiest language available that the story they were about to witness was a public warning against the evils of organized crime, a moral lesson designed to show that the path of the transgressor is hard and that crime does not pay. But the audience, possessing that healthy American skepticism that can spot a humbug through a brick wall, ignored the sermon entirely and focused their attention on the vestments of the preacher. They looked at Edward G. Robinson in Little Caesar standing on a street corner in a double-breasted suit that was sharp enough to slice an apple, barking orders to his underlings with the absolute unclouded authority of an emperor. They looked at James Cagney in The Public Enemy, a fellow who moved with the nervous, coiled energy of a terrier and possessed a habit of settling disputes by the simple expedient of shoving a grapefruit into a lady's face or hitting a rival over the head with a beer handle. To a man who had spent his morning standing in the cold rain waiting for a bowl of charity soup, these celluloid bandits were nothing short of a revelation. The ordinary fellow in 1931 felt entirely helpless, caught in the invisible grinding gears of an economic machine that didn't care a cent for his industriousness or his character. He had followed the rules, he had saved his pennies, he had listened to the bankers, and he had been thoroughly ruined for his trouble. But here, upon the silver screen, was a man who refused to be a victim. If the world didn't offer him a seat at the table, he didn't sit on the floor and weep. He simply walked into the room with a Tommy gun and took the head of the table for himself. It was a vicarious rebellion, carried out at the modest cost of a dime. For 2 hours, the clerk, the carpenter, and the unemployed bricklayer could forget the landlord's knock and the empty larder. They could pretend they were the ones wearing the silk shirts, drinking the forbidden hooch, and telling the police to go chase themselves. The gangster was the modern Robin Hood, with the slight modification that he generally forgot to distribute the spoils to the poor after he had finished taking them from the rich. But the public was willing to overlook this omission, provided he died in a grand, dramatic manner in the final reel, riddled with bullets and muttering a line of dialogue that would be quoted in every schoolyard from Maine to California. The ultimate irony of this cinematic craze was the fact that while Hollywood was busy turning the gangster into a tragic hero, the real-world models for these characters were experiencing a most unglamorous sort of downfall. The Grand King of the Chicago underworld, Mr. Al Capone himself, a man who had spent years treating the city as his personal fiefdom and the local government as his private laundry service, found his empire brought low in the autumn of 1931. He was not defeated by a heroic detective in a white hat, nor was he cornered in a dramatic shootout atop a warehouse. He was brought down by a small group of quiet, short-sleeved gentlemen armed with nothing more lethal than a collection of sharpened pencils and a row of adding machines. They convicted him of failing to pay his income taxes, proving that while the law may occasionally find itself powerless against a machine gun, it is absolutely relentless when it comes to the matter of its own cut. But the public didn't want to watch a movie about an accountant reviewing a ledger, no matter how dramatic the decimals might be. They preferred the myth to the reality. They wanted the legend of the self-made man who went wrong, but went wrong with a flourish. The studios turned out these pictures with the rhythmic regularity of a bakery turning out loaves of bread, and the public devoured them with an appetite that seemed entirely insatiable. It was a strange, whimsical commentary on the state of our civilization. We had built a world so orderly, so legalistic, and so thoroughly regulated that a man could scarcely take a step without running into an ordinance or a fee. Yet, the moment the machinery wobbled, our greatest delight was to escape into a fantasy of pure, unbridled lawlessness. We cheered for the fellow who broke the bank because we secretly suspected the bank had already broken us. It was a harmless enough amusement, no doubt, and it kept many a dollar flowing into the pockets of the theater owners at a time when they were leaning heavily toward bankruptcy. But it served as a reminder that beneath the thin, polished veneer of our respectable behavior, there still sits the old wild spirit of the frontier, a spirit that respects nothing so much as a man who can look danger in the eye, make his own rules, and go out with his boots on, even if he has to steal the boots in the first place. Chapter 11. The Death of Pavlova. If you have ever had the misfortune of watching a middle-aged merchant try to navigate a slippery sidewalk after a sudden sleet storm, you are already well aware that the human being, in his standard configuration, is not an instrument of refined grace. We are a heavy-footed, clumsy race, liable to trip over our own shadow if the light hits us at an unfamiliar angle. We stumble into rooms, we drop our hats into the mud, and we sit down upon sofas with a heavy, unvarnished thud that sounds remarkably like a sack of turnips falling out of the back of a wagon. Yet every now and again, through some strange oversight on the part of the celestial inspectors, there appears among us an individual who seems to have been manufactured entirely out of a different grade of material, someone who doesn't walk so much as skim the surface of the earth as if gravity were merely a suggestion they had politely decided to overlook. Such a creature was Madame Anna Pavlova, the Russian prima ballerina, who had spent the better part of 3 decades showing the world what it might look like if a soul could be turned into a pair of legs and a length of white tulle. But in the dark, damp January of 1931, while the rest of the world was busy calculating how many pennies they had left in the sugar bowl, Madame Pavlova took her final bow. It was a departure that passed almost unnoticed by the great thumping machinery of international commerce. Yet it marked the end of a particular kind of magic that the 20th century was rapidly making no provisions to replace. The ministry of grace. To understand the absolute whim of Pavlova's life, one must understand the bizarre nature of ballet itself. To the uninitiated, say, a country lawyer from Missouri or a lumberjack from the North Woods, the spectacle of a group of grown men and women running about on the tips of their toes, waving their arms in the air as if they were trying to frighten a hawk away from the chicken coop, is a matter that borders closely upon intellectual vacancy. It is an art form that requires a person to spend years training their muscles to perform tasks that nature never intended, such as standing upon a single toe for 3 minutes while pretending to be an enchanted princess who has been transformed into a fountain. Yet, when Pavlova took the stage, even the most hardened cynic found his jaw dropping down toward his waistcoat. She didn't merely dance. She became whatever illusion she was trying to sell you. Her masterpiece, as everyone from Paris to San Francisco knew, was The Dying Swan. It was a performance that lasted only a few minutes, set to a piece of cello music that was tender enough to make a tax collector weep. She would drift onto the stage, a cloud of white feathers, her arms moving with the slow, agonizing ripple of a bird that has taken its last wound but refuses to give up the sky. There was something in that performance that caught the very essence of our human condition. We are all, in one way or another, trying to keep our wings up while the world is doing its level best to pull us down into the mud. For 30 years, she carried this basket of beautiful illusions to every corner of the globe. She didn't confine her talents to the grand opera houses of Europe, where the audiences were stuffed into boiled shirts and diamonds like geese ready for the oven. She loaded her company into trains, steamships, and various shaky motor cars, delivering the gospel of the swan to mining towns in Australia, remote villages in South America, and muddy settlements in the American West, where the locals had previously believed that culture was simply the name for what happened to milk when you left it out on the porch for too long in July. The clatter of the Iron Age. But by 1931, the world had developed a taste for a very different kind of music. The delicate, silent flutter of the swan's wing was being thoroughly drowned out by the clatter of the machine age. This was the era of the pneumatic rivet gun echoing through the canyons of Manhattan, the steady, unthinking thrum of the automobile assembly line, the sharp, snapping rattle of the stock ticker telling its daily tale of ruin, the harsh, brassy roar of the jazz bands blasting through the speakers of a million radios. We were becoming a mechanical people, fascinated by weight, power, and speed. We measured our progress by the millions of tons of steel we could roll out of our furnaces, or by the height of the skyscrapers we could pile up against the clouds. There was a sudden, widespread suspicion that anything that couldn't be weighed on a scale or checked with a micrometer was somehow lacking in value. A ballerina was a beautiful thing, no doubt, but she couldn't dig a ditch, she couldn't manufacture a frozen pea, and she couldn't balance the ledger of a bankrupt bank in Vienna. When Pavlova arrived in the Netherlands in January, she was already exhausted. She had spent her life running a race against time, treating her body with the relentless severity of a drill sergeant who refuses to let the troops rest until the campaign is won. She caught a chill on a train, a cold, damp draft that found its way through the window of a railway carriage, and within a few days her lungs had turned into a battleground. The doctors gathered around her bed in The Hague with their stethoscopes and their solemn faces, looking very wise and doing absolutely nothing that was of any earthly use to the patient. They suggested an operation. They suggested rest. They suggested all the standard remedies that medical science employs when it is completely out of ideas. But Pavlova knew the curtain was coming down. Her legendary final words, whispered to her maid as the darkness closed in, were a simple command from a general who was ready to leave the field. "Prepare my swan costume." The light on the empty stage. The true comedy, or perhaps the true tragedy, depending upon how much iron you have in your soul, occurred a few nights later in London. The company was scheduled to perform at the Palace Theatre, and the house was packed with folks who had bought their tickets weeks before, unaware that the star had already departed for a country where there are no managers and no matinees. Instead of canceling the performance or hiring a substitute to try and fill the impossible shoes of the master, the director decided upon a stroke of theatrical genius that was as beautiful as it was terrible. When the music for The Dying Swan began to play, the curtains drew back to reveal a stage that was completely empty. There was no scenery, no chorus, and no ballerina. There was only a single bright circle of white light from the spotlight, moving slowly across the bare boards, tracing the path that Pavlova would have taken, fluttering and swaying to the rhythm of the music, until it reached the center of the stage, flickered for a moment, and went out. The audience didn't applaud. They sat there in the dark, holding their breath, suddenly realizing that they had just witnessed the departure of something that would never happen again. They were left with the music, the empty stage, and the cold reality of 1931 waiting for them outside the lobby doors. It was a perfect symbol for the year. The world was full of empty stages at that moment. The factories were dark, the banks were hollowed out, and the grand political institutions were sitting under a spotlight that revealed nothing but an absence of leadership. We had built a magnificent theater, but we had somehow managed to drive the artists out of the building, leaving us with nothing but the cold, mechanical hum of the projectors to keep us company in the dark. With the passing of the Swan, the 20th century took another long stride away from its youth. We were entering the lean, hard years where grace was viewed as a luxury we could no longer afford, and where the only dance the nation seemed capable of performing was the heavy, rhythmic stomp of boots on asphalt. We had traded the poetry of motion for the efficiency of the machine, and while the machines were undeniably clever, they were remarkably poor company on a cold winter night when a man was looking for some assurance that the human race was something more than a collection of greedy monkeys with a talent for arithmetic. Chapter 12. The Scottsboro Boys. If a man were to drop down from heaven with a pair of brass scales in his hand and a desire to see how human beings weigh out justice for their fellow creatures, he would do well to steer entirely clear of a courtroom when the weather is warm and the public blood is up. For justice, as we like to picture her in our stone monuments, is a majestic blindfolded lady holding her balances with an iron stillness, entirely indifferent to the shouting of the crowd outside the window. But in the year 1931, in the state of Alabama, the blindfold was snatched away. The scales were used chiefly as a blunt instrument to beat down the defenseless, and the lady herself was found to be shifting her footing with every passing breeze of popular prejudice. The great American jury system. We Americans have a most profound, almost superstitious reverence for what we call the due process of law. We boast that every man is entitled to be tried by a jury of his peers, a phrase which sounds remarkably grand until you travel down to the county seat and observe the actual composition of the box. More often than not, a jury is a collection of 12 citizens who have been selected principally because they possess a total lack of information on the subject under debate, an absolute disinclination to think for themselves, a desperate desire to finish the business as quickly as possible so they can return to their front porches and their tobacco plugs. In March of 1931, a freight train was rumbling its way through the pine woods of northern Alabama, carrying a cargo of gravel, timber, and a small army of penniless wanderers who were riding the rods in search of a day's labor. In those lean times, a boxcar was the only hotel the working man could afford, and it was a hotel where the guests were expected to provide their own bedding and maintain their own peace. A scuffle broke out between a group of white youths and a group of black youths, the sort of brief, foolish argument over territory that occurs whenever you crowd too many hungry men into a confined space. The white boys were worsted in the exchange and retreated from the train, nursing their bruises and their wounded pride. The gathering of the cohorts. Had the matter ended there, it would have been nothing more than a footnote in the long, dusty history of railroad brawls. But when the train ground to a halt at the village of Paint Rock, the station was surrounded by an armed posse of deputies and citizens who had been summoned by a frantic wire down the line. The black youths, 9 of them ranging in age from 13 to 20, were pulled from the cars and placed in irons. And then, as if the situation were not already sufficiently charged with peril, 2 white women climbed down from the timber cars and made an accusation that turned the local atmosphere from a state of mild agitation into a roaring furnace of moral outrage. They claimed they had been assaulted. It was an accusation that in the South of 1931 possessed the unique power to instantly dissolve the brain of every white man within a 50-mile radius, leaving in its place nothing but a blind, unthinking instinct for blood. The 9 boys were hurried along to the jail at Scottsboro, the county seat, while the telegraph wires hummed with the news, gathering the cohorts of righteousness from every hollow and hill in Jackson County. A mob is a most remarkable creature, possessing 100 heads but not a single brain. It moves by a kind of low-grade electricity, flowing along the path of least resistance, which is always the path toward a rope and a convenient tree limb. Within 48 hours, the town of Scottsboro was transformed into a carnival of vengeance. Thousands of folks converged upon the square, carrying their shotguns, their picnic baskets, and their small children, all eager to witness what they considered a necessary act of public hygiene. The local authorities, to their credit, did not allow a lynching. They did something far more cruel. They decided to hold a trial. The assembly line of justice, the machinery of the court was set in motion with a speed that would have made a New York express train look like a tortoise with a sprained ankle. The judge, a solemn gentleman named Hawkins, appointed the entire membership of the local bar to defend the boys, an act of generosity that meant in practice that absolutely nobody was responsible for looking after their interests. The defense finally devolved upon a single, aged attorney from Chattanooga, who had not had a chance to speak to his clients, look at the evidence, or even discover the boys' last names before the first jury was impaneled. The trials began on the 6th of April, and they were carried out with the rhythmic regularity of a slaughterhouse turning out sausages. The evidence was a patchwork of contradictions delivered by witnesses who couldn't remember the time of day or the color of the sky, but who were absolutely certain about the guilt of the prisoners. The prosecutors did not need facts. They needed only to wave the American flag, invoke the sacred honor of Southern womanhood, and point a finger at the frightened children sitting at the defense table. The accusation to the 12-minute jury, to the brass band. Outside the open windows of the courtroom, the crowd stood 10 deep in the dust, their faces pressed against the glass, their murmurs rising and falling like the sound of the surf. When the first verdict of guilty was announced, the multitude did not merely cheer. They erupted into a frenzy of delight, and a local brass band, which had been waiting on the lawn for just such an occasion, struck up a lively tune to celebrate the triumph of the law. It was a spectacle that would have made a savage blush. This spectacle of a Christian community marching around a courthouse to the sound of horns and drums because they had just secured the right to send a few boys to the electric chair. Within 4 days, 8 of the 9 boys had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to die. The youngest, a child of 13, was spared the death penalty only because the jury couldn't agree on whether to kill him or merely lock him up for life. The business was concluded, the records were wrapped in red tape, and Jackson County prepared to return to its usual peaceable routine, satisfied that it had given the world a beautiful lesson in the efficiency of Southern jurisprudence. The ideological stew. But the wind, as I have noted, has a habit of changing direction when you least expect it. The news of the Scottsboro verdicts leaped over the borders of Alabama and raced across the face of the earth, producing a storm of indignation that left the local citizens utterly bewildered. They had thought they were merely putting down an ordinary piece of local disorder. They found, to their astonishment, that they had walked into an international spotlight. A group called the International Labor Defense, an organization managed chiefly by the Communist Party in New York, swooped down upon the case, brushing aside the polite middle-class lawyers of the NAACP and taking charge of the appeal with a furious ideological energy. Suddenly, the 9 boys from the boxcar were no longer just prisoners in an Alabama jail. They were the symbols of the global class struggle, their names printed in pamphlets in Berlin, Moscow, and Paris. Money began to flow in from corners of the world that the citizens of Scottsboro had never even heard of, and the case was dragged upward toward the Supreme Court, turning into a long, agonizing duel between the old customs of the South and the changing conscience of the nation. It was a grand, bitter comedy. The communists used the boys to preach the gospel of Karl Marx. The white supremacists used them to preach the gospel of the old plantation, and the boys themselves sat in their cells, entirely forgotten in the middle of the shouting, wondering if they would live to see another summer, or if they would be sacrificed to satisfy the vanity of 2 factions that cared infinitely more for their own theories than for the lives of 9 poor children who had only wanted to ride a train to Memphis. As 1931 drew toward its close, the execution dates were stayed. The legal battle lines were drawn, and the nation was left to contemplate the ugly truth that had been uncovered in the dust of Scottsboro. We had built a great complex system of courts, appeals, and constitutional guarantees, but it remained a machine that was driven by human hands. And when those hands are trembling with fear and hatred, the machine is perfectly capable of grinding up the innocent with the same smooth, indifferent efficiency it uses for the guilty. It was a dark ledger for the year, a reminder that civilization is a very thin coat of paint indeed, and that if you scratch the surface even a little bit, you are liable to find the old wild beast of the mob waiting underneath, ready to tear the rulebook to pieces the moment the wind sets from the wrong quarter. Chapter 13. The Discovery of the Neutron. It is a most profound and enduring feature of the human animal that he cannot bear to leave a closed door alone. If you show a man a stout oak portal with 3 heavy brass padlocks and a sign that reads, "Under no circumstances look inside," he will spend the next 4 hours trying to peek through the keyhole, or finding a crowbar, or at the very least wondering if there isn't some variety of forbidden bacon hidden on the other side. We are an inquisitive, meddlesome lot, and the moment we finish measuring the continents and counting the stars, we instantly turn our attention to things that are so spectacularly small that they cannot be seen even if a fellow were to squint until his ears ached. For generations, the philosophers, who are merely gentlemen who get paid to think about things that ordinary people don't have the leisure to worry about, told us that the atom was the ultimate boundary. It was the hard, indivisible billiard ball of the universe. They declared with the immense satisfaction of a clerk who has finally balanced his ledger that when you chopped a piece of iron or a potato down to its very smallest piece, you arrived at a tiny, solid speck that simply refused to be chopped any further. It was a neat, comfortable theory that gave everyone a sense of security. But then came the 20th century, and a group of restless, short-sleeved mechanics with university degrees went to work on the billiard ball with hammers, wires, and magnets. They cracked it wide open and discovered, to the general embarrassment of the textbook manufacturers, that the inside of an atom was not solid at all. It was a vast, echoing wilderness, a miniature solar system where tiny, electrically charged spirits performed a frantic, never-ending waltz in the dark. The domestic arrangements of the matter. By the time the world stumbled into the dark winter of 1931, science had settled upon a very orderly, very domestic arrangement for the subatomic world. They had found 2 distinct inhabitants in the neighborhood: the proton, a heavy, respectable fellow who possessed a positive electrical charge. He sat in the parlor at the center of the house, the nucleus, carrying himself with the immense gravity of a bank president who owns the mortgage on the universe. The electron, a light, flighty, thoroughly negative creature who spent her time buzzing around the outside of the house at a tremendous speed, like a frantic ant who suspects someone has left the gas stove on in the kitchen. It was a beautiful arrangement, simple enough for a politician to understand and symmetrical enough to satisfy the aesthetic requirements of a bishop. There was only one small inconvenient difficulty with this neat little ledger. The math was entirely wrong. When the scientists placed an atom upon their celestial scales, they discovered that it weighed twice as much as it had any right to. It was as if a man were to pack a single trunk with 20 pounds of trousers and 20 pounds of shirts, lock the lid, place it upon the station scale, and find that the indicator dial leaped instantly to 80 pounds. A sensible man would assume that either the scale was a humbug or that some mischievous clerk had snuck a couple of iron anvils into the bottom of the chest while he wasn't looking. The expected weight, 2. The actual scale, 2. The cosmic discrepancy. But science cannot tolerate an anvil it cannot explain. For a decade, the great minds of the age suspected there was a third party hiding in the cellar, a ghost that possessed weight but carried no electrical passport. They looked for him with every apparatus available, but searching for a neutral particle is like looking for a black cat in a coal cellar on a moonless night, especially if the cat isn't inclined to make any noise. Because it carried no electrical charge, it didn't attract anything, it didn't repel anything, and it didn't leave any muddy footprints across the photographic plates of the laboratories. It walked through the world like a polite phantom, entirely indifferent to the laws of attraction and repulsion that kept the rest of civilization from falling into the creek. The tinkering in the Cavendish. The race to corner this ghost reached its climax in the long gray months of 1931. Over in Paris, the Joliot-Curies, a pair of brilliant young idealists who had inherited the family talent for playing with radium, were busy shooting high-energy rays at sheets of paraffin wax. They noticed that a strange, powerful radiation was knocking protons out of the wax like pins in a bowling alley. They assumed it was merely a very strong variety of light, an explanation that made about as much sense as suggesting that a man had been knocked off his horse by a particularly bright beam of sunshine. But across the English Channel, in the damp, drafty rooms of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, a quiet, lean gentleman named James Chadwick looked at the reports from Paris and shook his head. He knew that light, no matter how much energy it stuffed into its pockets, didn't possess the muscle to heave a heavy proton out of its seat. He went to work with the relentless, silent industry of a detective tracking a bank robber, using an apparatus that looked for all the world like a collection of tin cans, sealing wax, and old copper wires held together by nothing more substantial than the grace of God and British determination. Chadwick realized that the mystery rays were actually a swarm of those long-sought neutral particles. He called them neutrons. They were particles that possessed exactly the same weight as a proton, but with a personality that was entirely nonpartisan. They didn't vote with the positives. They didn't vote with the negatives. They simply minded their own business and carried the weight of the universe on their shoulders without ever making a speech about it. The neutron was the perfect diplomat. It carried no political banner, demanded no taxes, and slipped past the subatomic border guards because it didn't possess an electrical passport to show the customs inspector the moonshine and the dynamite. The discovery was hailed by the newspapers as a magnificent triumph of pure useless knowledge. The commentators of 1931, who were currently busy trying to figure out how to pay for their groceries with a depreciated currency, treated the neutron as a harmless academic curiosity, the sort of thing that keeps professors from wandering into traffic or writing poetry about the spring. Even Lord Rutherford, the grand old lion of the Cavendish Laboratory, and the man who had trained Chadwick, told the public with great emphasis that any fellow who looked to the atom as a source of practical power was talking pure moonshine. He declared that the energy required to break the atom was far greater than any energy one could hope to extract from the ruin. It is a grand and delicious piece of irony to contemplate today. Here were these quiet, serious men in woolen cardigans, sitting in a room that smelled of tobacco smoke and battery acid, drinking their tea and reassuring the world that their little toys were completely harmless. They thought they were merely cataloging the inventory of the great architect. They had no notion that they had just uncovered the secret combination to the lockbox of civilization. For the very quality that made the neutron so difficult to find, its complete lack of an electrical charge, was precisely what made it the most dangerous key ever placed into the hands of the human race. A proton or an electron, when shot at an atom, is instantly shoved away by the electrical shields of the castle. But the neutron doesn't care for shields. It can saunter right up to the front door of the heaviest nucleus, knock politely, walk inside, and cause an explosion that can shake a continent. The scientists in 1931 were like a group of children who had found a very large, very heavy iron key in the garden dirt. They polished it, they weighed it, and they wrote long scholarly papers about its shape, completely unaware that the key belonged to the door of the powder magazine, and that they were eventually going to figure out how to turn the lock. It was the ultimate ledger of the year. While the great political structures of the earth were revealing themselves to be thoroughly fragile, while the League of Nations was sitting on its hands, and the great banks were collapsing under the weight of their own vanity. Science was moving forward with a quiet, mechanical precision that was entirely indifferent to the troubles of the day. We were a species that couldn't even figure out how to distribute our own wheat or balance our own budgets. Yet, we had succeeded in tracking down the invisible ghost that held the stars together. We had found the switch for the lights of civilization, and as the year rolled on toward its end, we simply left it there on the workbench, a tiny, heavy match, waiting for someone to come along with enough folly to scratch it against the wall. Chapter 14. The Deepening Drought. There is a long-standing, beautiful piece of human vanity which holds that the earth is a reliable business partner, bound by some celestial contract to provide a man with regular seasons, dependable rains, and a predictable profit, provided he treats the dirt with a reasonable amount of respect and does not swear too loudly on Sundays. We assume that because we have purchased a piece of land, registered the deed at the county courthouse, and turned the sod upside down with a shiny John Deere plow, the sky is somehow obligated to look down upon our ledger and deliver the necessary moisture at precisely the moment our corn begins to silk. But in the scorching summer of 1931, the sky over the mid-American plains didn't merely forget its obligations. It tore up the contract, threw the pieces into the wind, and turned the entire heart of the continent into a magnificent shimmering furnace. History, which has a habit of being remarkably heavy-handed when it decides to teach the human race a lesson, demonstrated that when nature determines to be inhospitable, she does not do it by halves. She does it with the absolute unbridled enthusiasm of a landlord who has decided to clear out the tenants and board up the windows for the winter. The Great American Humbug. To understand the absolute whim of the catastrophe that was beginning to settle upon the American West, one must first understand the grand intellectual architecture of the boom that preceded it. For decades, the promoters, the railroad agents, and the various short-sleeved visionaries who made their living selling real estate to optimistic greenhorns had preached a magnificent doctrine known across the frontier as rain follows the plow. It was a theory constructed with a total lack of scientific evidence, but a generous helping of pure American faith. It held that the very act of breaking the heavy prairie sod released moisture into the atmosphere. The planting of trees altered the path of the clouds. The metallic vibration of the steam locomotives passing along the iron rails coaxed the rain out of the heavens through a kind of mechanical sympathy. It was a beautiful story, and it worked beautifully so long as the rain fell of its own accord. A generation of homesteaders poured into the high plains of Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and the Dakotas, armed with nothing but their high hopes and their iron shares. They cleared away the deep, tangled buffalo grass that had held the soil together since the days of Noah, turned the dark loam up to the sun, and planted millions of acres of wheat. For a few years, during the Great War and the fat years that followed, the earth complied with the humbug. The rains came, the crops grew tall, and the farmers looked upon their bank accounts with the smug satisfaction of men who believed they had successfully domesticated the weather. Man is a creature who cannot receive a favor from Providence without immediately assuming that he earned it through his own superior intelligence and remarkable moral character. But by 1931, the clock had struck midnight, and the carriage was rapidly turning back into a pumpkin. The sun as a cross-examiner. The drought did not arrive with a sudden dramatic clap of thunder or a spectacular alignment of the planets. It arrived with a quiet, creeping stillness. In the spring of the year, the rains simply failed to appear. The clouds drifted across the horizon, pale and thin as cheesecloth, refusing to drop a single bucket of moisture upon the waiting fields. By June, the sun had ceased to be a benevolent provider of warmth and had taken on the character of a fierce, unblinking cross-examiner, staring down from a sky that had turned the color of hot brass. It did not merely shine, it searched the earth for any remaining drop of water, baking the clay until it cracked into long, jagged fissures that looked for all the world like the wrinkles on the face of an old centenarian. The crops, which had started the spring with their usual green optimism, grew stunted, withered, and turned a sickly, premature yellow before they had even reached the height of a man's knee. The wind, which had once been a welcome visitor that cooled the brows of the harvesters, became a malignant presence, a hot, dry breath from the south that felt as if it had been piped directly out of the engine room of a steamship. It blew day after day, week after week, sucking the last remnants of moisture from the leaves until the stalks stood there in the dust, dry and brittle as toothpicks, rattling in the gale with a sound that was alarmingly like a funeral march. The small creeks and creeks dried up first, their beds turning into ribbons of gray mud that hardened into concrete under the heat. The rivers followed, shrinking until they were nothing more than thin, muddy trickles wandering through vast deserts of white sand. It was said by the local humorists, who are always at their best when the situation is entirely desperate, that the catfish in the Arkansas River had taken to carrying canteen bags on their backs, and that the frogs had reached the age of 3 without ever learning how to swim, having spent their entire lives waiting for a puddle large enough to practice in. Traveling real estate. Then came the dust. Now that the buffalo grass was gone, now that the soil had been pulverized by the plow and left naked to the elements without a single root to hold it down, the wind discovered that it had been provided with the largest playground on the planet. It picked up the topsoil an ounce at a time and heaved it upward into the sky, turning the atmosphere into a thick, choking broth of real estate. It was a migration of property that would have baffled any lawyer. A farmer in Kansas could sit on his porch and watch his neighbor's best 40 acres pass overhead at 30 miles an hour, bound for a destination that nobody could predict. The dust storms, the black blizzards, as the folks began to call them, loomed on the northern horizon like giant mountains of smoke, miles high and completely blotting out the sun until the chickens went to roost at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and the housewives had to light the kerosene lamps just to find the kitchen sink. The dust found its way through every crack, every keyhole, and every loose board in the homesteads. It settled upon the dinner plates before the soup could be poured, the sheets of the beds while the family slept, leaving a neat, dark outline of their heads upon the pillows, the internal mechanisms of the watches stopping the time as if the year itself had decided to cease its progress, the lungs of the children producing a dry, hacking cough that the country doctors could do nothing to cure except to recommend a wet rag over the nose. It was a dark, surreal comedy. The people lived in a state of perpetual twilight, their faces coated with a thin layer of grime that made everyone look like a coal miner who had forgotten to wash before dinner. They spent their days shoveling the sand off their front steps as if it were snow, only to see it return the moment they turned their backs. The Council of the Wise. Down in Washington, the government viewed the disaster with the same helpless administrative bewilderment that it applied to the collapse of the banks. President Hoover's administration appointed committees, issued bulletins on soil conservation, and suggested that if the farmers would only practice a more scientific method of cultivation, the earth would eventually return to its senses. It was a marvelous performance, akin to offering a man a copy of a dictionary while his house is being carried away by a tornado. The politicians spoke of the drought as a temporary emergency, a minor fluctuation in the grand scheme of national prosperity, failing to realize that they were witnessing the literal unmaking of the continent. The frontier was packing its bags and moving east. The farmers themselves did not make speeches. They stood in their yards, their hands shoved deep into their empty pockets, watching the horizon with an expression of quiet, stoic endurance that is the unique property of men who have spent their lives at the mercy of the elements. They had survived the grasshoppers, they had survived the panic of '93, and they had survived the low prices of the '20s. But this was something different. This was an enemy that couldn't be fought with a club or cheated with a marked card. It was the land itself, turning its face away from them, declaring in unmistakable terms that their presence was no longer desired. As 1931 drew toward its conclusion, the drought showed no sign of breaking. The winter came, but it was a dry, dusty winter that brought no snow to cover the wounds of the earth. The topsoil kept on moving, a silent, dark caravan of ruin traveling across the sky, leaving behind a landscape that was rapidly beginning to resemble the face of the moon. We had thought we were the masters of the wilderness, that we could rewrite the geography of the nation to suit our own ledgers. Yet we were learning that nature is an old and very patient landlord, and when she decides to collect the rent in full, she is perfectly capable of turning our finest dreams into a cloud of gray dust that blows away before the wind, leaving us with nothing but our empty hands and our long, uncomfortable memories. Chapter 15. The Zeppelin's Arctic Tour. There is a distinct, incurable brand of madness that strikes a man the moment he realizes there is a spot on the globe where no civilized boot has ever trod, and where the local inhabitants consist entirely of bored seals and disgruntled polar bears. A sensible person, upon looking at a map of the North Pole and observing that it is composed exclusively of frozen water, shifting ice cakes, and a temperature that can turn a man's whiskers into a cluster of icicles in the space of 3 breaths, would naturally decide to stay in his parlor, stir the fire, and express his profound gratitude that he lives in Missouri. But humanity, as we have had frequent occasion to observe in this ledger, is not a sensible species. We are a race of restless, meddlesome wanderers who cannot look at a blank space on a chart without immediately wishing to go there, suffer an immense amount of physical discomfort, and then return home to write a book about how thoroughly miserable we were. For centuries, this polar itching was carried out by means of stout wooden ships that regularly got crushed by the ice like walnuts under a hammer, or by teams of long-suffering dogs pulling sledges across the hummocks while their masters dined upon old boots and frozen pemmican. The silver whale of the skies. But by the summer of 1931, the spirit of mechanical progress had decided that the old ways of freezing to death were entirely too slow and lacked the proper theatrical flair. If we were going to visit the frozen wastes of the North, we would do it in style. We would do it by means of the Graf Zeppelin, a monstrous silver-skinned cigar of the heavens that was longer than 2 city blocks and filled with several million cubic feet of highly flammable hydrogen gas. To float across the Arctic in an airship is the sort of magnificent humbug that would have made the builders of the Tower of Babel look like men of timid imagination. The Graf Zeppelin was essentially a grand floating grand hotel that had been stripped of its foundations, equipped with 5 massive Maybach engines, and launched into the clouds to see what would happen next. Underneath the great shimmering belly of the beast hung the gondola, a structure of high luxury where a passenger could sit in a plush armchair, peer through a polished plate glass window at the abyss below, and partake in a bowl of hot turtle soup, while the thermometer outside was registering a temperature that would have made an anvil shiver. The warm dining cabin, daub and 3 inches of cloth and duralumin, tam cross, the polar abyss. The commander of this silver leviathan was Dr. Hugo Eckener, a German gentleman of immense gravity, possessing a thick mustache and a gaze that suggested he had spent his entire life calculating wind currents and barometric pressures. Dr. Eckener looked at the map of the Arctic in July of 1931 and decided that the time had come to perform a grand scientific reconnaissance. He gathered a crew of international savants, Germans, Russians, Americans, and various other fellows who loved nothing so much as a complicated thermometer, and set sail from Germany, bound for the absolute middle of nowhere. There is no triumph of modern science quite so marvelous as our ability to transport our domestic comforts into the very heart of the wilderness, allowing us to view the destruction of nature from a position of absolute safety and refined ease. The rendezvous at the end of the earth. The absolute whim of the expedition reached its climax when the Zeppelin arrived over the remote ice-choked waters of Franz Josef Land. There, nestled among the icebergs like a black beetle in a sugar bowl, was the Soviet icebreaker Malagan. The two monuments of 20th century engineering had agreed to meet at the 81st parallel for the purpose of exchanging mail, an administrative task that would have been simple enough in Berlin or Moscow, but which took on the character of a celestial miracle when carried out in a landscape that didn't possess a single post office. The Zeppelin descended through the thick, gray polar fog, its giant shadow gliding across the pack ice like a phantom whale. The engines roared, the propellers thrashed the frozen air, and the great ship hovered just a few feet above the water, its ground ropes dangling down toward the deck of the icebreaker. The crew of the Malagan, wearing heavy furs and looking like a collection of animated bears, stood on the deck, waving their hats and shouting greetings in a language that was entirely drowned out by the thunder of the German machinery. The mail bags were exchanged by means of a rope and a basket, a performance carried out with the solemn efficiency of two clerks passing a ledger across a desk. It was a beautiful piece of nonsense. Here were two nations, one a shattered republic struggling under the weight of its debts, the other a massive socialist experiment trying to build a new world out of iron and decrees, meeting in a place where neither of them belonged for the sole purpose of ensuring that a few stamped envelopes could boast that they had traveled by air over the Arctic Circle. The ledger of the unproductive ice. For several days, the Zeppelin cruised across the unknown reaches of the polar sea, mapping islands that didn't have any trees, measuring currents that didn't have any fish, and taking photographs of a landscape that looked precisely like a white sheet that had been left out on the clothesline during a gale. The scientists were in a state of perpetual ecstasy. They turned their knobs, they read their dials, and they filled their notebooks with columns of figures that were no doubt highly important to other scientists, though they were of no earthly use to anyone else. They discovered that the Arctic was not a solid continent of ice, but a restless, grinding jigsaw puzzle of floes, constantly shifting and breaking apart under the influence of the wind and the tide. It was a place of profound, terrifying loneliness, a vast desert of white and blue where the sun never set but contextually never provided any warmth, remaining fixed in the sky like a pale, unblinking eye that had grown entirely tired of looking at the snow. And yet, inside the Zeppelin, the life of the gentleman traveler proceeded with a mechanical regularity. The linen was white, the silver was polished, and the cook turned out pastries with the unbothered serenity of a baker in Munich. A man could stand at the window, watch a polar bear scramble across an ice floe in fear of the giant shadow overhead, and then turn around to ask his neighbor if he would care for another cup of coffee. It was the ultimate victory of the machine over the wilderness, a proof that if you give an engineer enough aluminum and silk, he can carry the parlor of civilization to the very roof of the world. The view from the clouds. The grand irony of the entire spectacle, of course, was the timing of the cruise. The year 1931 was a period when the great structures of human society were revealing themselves to be thoroughly fragile. The banks were locking their doors, the empires were loosening their grip, and millions of men were standing on the stone sidewalks of the great cities, wondering where they would find their next meal. Yet, at that very moment, science had succeeded in sending a silver palace across the North Pole, proving that we could master the air, tame the frost, and map the inaccessible corners of the globe. We were a species that could build an artificial mountain in Manhattan and float a luxury hotel over the polar ice. Yet we could not, for the life of us, figure out how to manage our own abundance or keep our own people from starving in the midst of plenty. The Graf Zeppelin returned to its hangar in Germany after a week in the north, its hull uninjured, its crew safe, and its notebooks stuffed with the secrets of the ice. It was a magnificent triumph, a glorious page in the ledger of human ingenuity. But as the great ship settled back into its cradle, the cheering of the crowds faded away, leaving behind the old, heavy silence of the lean years. The silver whale had shown us what we could do when we were at our best, when we were brave, clever, and determined to see what was on the other side of the hill. But it had also left us with the uncomfortable realization that the real wilderness was not the one at the North Pole, but the one we had created in our own streets, a wilderness of confusion and distress that no airship, no matter how grand or how silver, was ever going to be able to fly over. Chapter 16. The League of Nations Paralysis. If you were to gather 100 village fools into a large white room, dress them in immaculate coats, provide them with translation headphones that whisper their nonsense back to them in 3 distinct languages, and ask them to determine the most equitable method for preventing a neighbor's dog from barking at the moon, you would eventually receive a document of extraordinary length, remarkable vocabulary, and an absolute vacancy of utility. You would have invented, on a modest scale, the League of Nations. There is a sublime, almost theological beauty in the human belief that a catastrophe can be permanently averted by the simple expedient of forming a committee. We have a deep, unshakable faith that if we can only get enough high-minded gentlemen to sit in a semicircle, breathe the same air, and sign their names to a parchment that has been decorated with ribbons and red wax, the old wild instincts of the race, the instincts for land, for plunder, and for hitting one another over the head with heavy objects, will instantly dissolve into a general cloud of Christian charity and parliamentary order. By the autumn of 1931, this great experiment in international hand-wringing had taken up its residence in Geneva, a Swiss city of the highest respectability. Switzerland was the perfect stage for such a performance. It is a country that has made a very comfortable business out of being entirely indifferent to the troubles of everyone else, providing a clean, quiet laboratory where the politicians of the earth could debate the destruction of civilization without ever having to hear the sound of a gun or smell the smoke of a burning barn. The architecture of the grand humbug. The League was governed by a document known as the Covenant, a masterpiece of legal architecture that was designed with such exquisite care that it could prevent a war in precisely the same way an umbrella can prevent a thunderstorm, which is to say, it worked beautifully, provided the weather remained entirely dry. The moment the clouds gathered, the machine revealed its true nature. It was an elaborate apparatus for doing absolutely nothing, carried out with a level of dignity that was nothing short of majestic. The halls of Geneva were populated by a new species of human being, the professional diplomat. He was a fellow who had spent his entire life learning how to speak for 3 hours without ever arriving at a conclusion that could be considered binding by a court of law. He moved through the corridors with a soft, cat-like tread, his face set in an expression of permanent polite concern, carrying a leather briefcase that was stuffed with draft resolutions that had been amended until they were completely transparent, formal protests that had been toned down to avoid hurting anyone's feelings, minutes of previous meetings that had been called to schedule subsequent meetings, a generous supply of throat lozenges to sustain him through the long, dusty hours of semantic evasion. The magic of the place was the translation system. A gentleman from France could stand at the podium, turn his eyes toward the ceiling, and deliver a furious lecture on the sanctity of treaties. And by the time his words had passed through the wires into the ears of the British, the Italians, and the Japanese, the sharp edges had been thoroughly planned off by the industrious young ladies in the glass booths. The insult had become an inquiry, the threat had become a suggestion, and the declaration of intent had been transformed into a request for further information. It was a marvelous triumph of modern science, ensuring that no one ever truly understood what anyone else was saying, which was often the only thing that kept them from declaring war before the lunch hour. The fire in the east and the wet match. The great shattering test of this international palace of words arrived, as we have already seen, when the Imperial Japanese Army decided to take its long, uninvited walk through Manchuria. The Chinese government, having a naive trust in the promises of the Western world, instantly sent a frantic wire to Geneva, invoking Article 11 of the Covenant and asking the League to step in, put out the fire, and tell the Japanese to return their boots to their own side of the fence. The response from Geneva was a master class in administrative choreography. The Council did not panic. They did not call for the guard. They did not even raise their voices. They did what any sensible group of politicians does when confronted with a burglar who is currently carrying away the parlor clock. They called for a point of order. When a house is on fire, a wise man does not spend 3 weeks debating whether the water should be brought in a wooden bucket or a tin pail. He grabs the nearest vessel and throws it at the flames. But the League was not a wise man. It was a parliament of lawyers, and they were deeply concerned with the proper color of the buckets. The Japanese delegate, a gentleman of immaculate manners named Kenkichi Yoshizawa, sat in his chair with the unbothered serenity of a cat that has just finished the cream. When the Chinese representative wept and pleaded for justice, Mr. Yoshizawa politely adjusted his spectacles and informed the council that there was no invasion at all. It was merely a local incident, a minor misunderstanding between railway guards and some local banditti, and that his government was currently engaged in withdrawing its troops, though he omitted to mention that they were withdrawing them further into Chinese territory. The League took this explanation, clutched it to its chest like a holy relic, and expressed its profound gratitude for the reassurance. They passed a resolution, a beautiful, rolling sentence that took 48 hours to draft, politely requesting both parties to cease their hostilities and return to their original positions. It was a document that possessed all the moral authority of a grandmother telling a pair of schoolboys to stop fighting in the mud, with the slight difference that the schoolboys were armed with field artillery and machine guns. The master class in hand-wringing. As the weeks dragged on into the dark winter of 1931, and as the Japanese army continued its steady, relentless march across the provinces, the League realized that its resolutions were being treated by the military authorities in the field with precisely the same respect one accords to a scrap of old newspaper blowing down the street. It was becoming dreadfully embarrassing. The audience was beginning to laugh at the actors. So the League deployed its ultimate weapon, the most devastating tool in the entire arsenal of bureaucratic delay, the Fact-Finding Commission. The invasion occurs to 3 months of debate, to the Lytton Commission takes a cruise, to the fire consumes the province. They appointed a group of elderly, respectable gentlemen, led by the Earl of Lytton, and asked them to travel to the Far East to find out if there was actually a war going on, or if the whole thing was merely an optical illusion caused by the distance. It was a magnificent strategy. The commission had to be selected with a careful regard for national vanity. They had to pack their trunks, they had to secure passage on a comfortable steamship, and they had to travel across 2 oceans, arriving in Manchuria months after the Japanese had already finished building their barracks, installing their governors, and renaming the territory to suit their own imperial ledger. It was the comedy of the unmoved buckets carried out on a global stage, while the commission was looking for facts that could be found by anyone with a map and a daily newspaper. The League sat on its hands in Geneva, debating the exact definition of aggression, and wondering if it would be bad form to suggest that perhaps the Japanese were being a bit inconsiderate. They were terrified of taking any step that might require them to actually do something, such as stopping the trade of oil or weapons with the aggressor. Every nation looked at its own pocketbook and decided that while peace was a beautiful thing, it wasn't worth the price of a single factory order. The ledger of the fading light. The true tragedy of the League's paralysis in 1931 was not that it failed to save Manchuria, it was that it succeeded in revealing to every rogue, every dictator, and every ambitious general across the planet that the international community was entirely hollow. The grand shield of collective security was shown to be nothing more than a painted stage prop, constructed of paper and glue, that would fall over the moment someone leaned against it with a bit of determination. We look back at those gentlemen in Geneva with a mixture of pity and contempt, marveling at their capacity to hide their cowardice behind the fine clothing of diplomacy. They thought they were preserving the peace by avoiding a confrontation. They were actually merely organizing the schedule for the great slaughter that was to follow. They had built a magnificent temple to human reason, but they had forgotten to provide it with a single tooth, leaving it at the mercy of any beast that chose to wander into the sanctuary and look for its dinner. As the year rolled toward its close, the snow fell upon the mountains of Switzerland, covering the city of Geneva in a white, pristine blanket of quiet. Inside the grand hall, the lights were turned low. The delegates returned to their hotels to enjoy their dinners, and the secretaries filed away the reports of the year's failure into neat metal cabinets, where they would remain undisturbed until the house caught fire for good. The great experiment had sat on its hands. The fire had burned unchecked, and the world was left with the cold, uncomfortable knowledge that when the night comes down, and it was coming down fast in 1931, a man is entirely alone in the dark with nothing to protect him but his own strength and his own willingness to fight for his life. Chapter 17. The Fluctuations of Trade. From the very moment that the first 2 primitive men discovered that one possessed a particularly fine specimen of a flint arrowhead, while the other was the proprietor of a remarkably plump and well-smoked rack of prehistoric ribs, the human race has been afflicted with an absolute, incurable passion for swapping. It is an instinct as old as the hills and twice as stubborn. A man will look upon his own property, be it a bushel of wheat, a basket of apples, or a freshly manufactured steam engine, and he will instantly develop a profound intellectual weariness regarding its presence. He does not wish to look at it any longer. He wishes to find a fellow across the river, or across the mountain, or across the ocean, who has a surplus of something else, and he wishes to engage in a quiet, mutually satisfactory transaction that leaves both parties feeling as if they have thoroughly bested the other in a contest of wits. It is a beautiful, harmonious system when left to the management of ordinary horse traders and village shopkeepers. But the moment you take this natural, peaceable flow of commerce and place it under the care of a national legislature, a body composed chiefly of gentlemen who have never raised a potato or sold a barrel of flour in their lives, but who possess an infinite capacity for drafting laws that look magnificent on parchment and work like a plague of locusts in the field, the whole business descends instantly into a farce of the highest caliber. By the year of our Lord 1931, the great nations of the earth had succeeded in transforming the international marketplace into a chaotic game of blind man's buff. The global economy, which had grown fat and prosperous during the previous decades by the simple expedient of buying things where they were cheap and selling them where they were dear, found itself suddenly caught in a net of tariffs, embargoes, and customs regulations so thick and tangled that a single crate of oranges could scarcely cross a border without requiring a legal staff, a notary public, and a formal apology to the local Ministry of Agriculture. The Great Wall of Paperwork. The grand pioneering monument to this new economic philosophy was, of course, our own American contribution, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Passed during the previous year, but reaching its full, magnificent rotten flowering in 1931, it was an architectural wonder of the legal mind. The short-sleeved magicians in Washington had looked upon the sputtering embers of the domestic economy and determined that the most efficient method for restoring the fire was to surround the entire United States with a wall of taxes so high that no foreign goods could possibly climb over it. They argued with the earnest, sweat-browed sincerity of a medicine show doctor selling a patent cure for rheumatism that if we only stopped buying silk from France, sugar from Cuba, and cattle from Canada, the American working man would instantly find his pockets stuffed with gold and his table groaning with the fat of the land. It was a marvelous theory, built upon the sturdy assumption that the other nations of the world would simply sit on their hands, weep into their handkerchiefs, and continue to buy our surplus cotton and automobiles while we refused to accept a single nickel's worth of their own produce in return. A politician is a creature who can look at a water pipe, observe that the water is flowing out of his neighbor's yard into his own, and conclude that the best way to increase the pressure is to take a large hammer and smash the pipe at the property line. The result of this legislative genius was as instantaneous as it was disastrous. The rest of the world looked at the American wall, checked their own ledgers, and decided with sudden, unanimous enthusiasm that two could play at the game of economic suicide. Within months, a frantic, tit-for-tat retaliation swept across the face of the globe like a catching disease. Canada, being a neighbor of a proud and independent disposition, instantly raised her own duties on American steel and machinery, turning her face toward the British Empire. France clapped a quota on foreign wheat. Germany built a fortress around her coal mines, and even Great Britain, the old traditional high priest of free trade, the nation that had spent a century preaching to the rubes that a border should be nothing more substantial than a line on a map, finally succumbed to the panic and began drafting her own ledger of imperial preferences. The carousels of retaliation. The international markets were transformed into a series of isolated fortresses, each garrisoned by a collection of nervous customs inspectors who spent their days examining the luggage of travelers for forbidden cheeses or illegal lengths of woolen cloth. The harbors of the great ports, New York, London, Hamburg, Marseille, became places of a strange, eerie quiet. The grand steamships, those iron leviathans that had been built to carry the abundance of the continents back and forth across the sea, sat idly at the piers, their boilers cold, their crews discharged, and their holds as empty as a church treasury on a Tuesday morning. The ultimate whim of the situation was the grand paradox of overproduction. Because every nation had locked its doors against its neighbors, the world found itself trapped in a state of affairs that would have baffled any sane philosopher from the Middle Ages. It was a crisis not of scarcity, but of a terrifying, suffocating abundance that nobody could afford to purchase. In Kansas, the elevators were bursting with millions of bushels of golden wheat, piled so high that the boards creaked under the strain, while in the great cities of the East, men were walking the streets with holes in their boots, their stomachs empty, waiting in the rain for a bowl of charity broth. In Brazil, the coffee planters looked upon a harvest so immense that it threatened to bankrupt every bank in Rio de Janeiro, and having no foreign market left to them, they began using the precious beans to fire the fireboxes of their steam locomotives, turning the railway lines into a fragrant caffeine-scented wilderness, while the clerks of London were reducing themselves to a diet of chicory and hot water. In the American South, the warehouses were choked with bales of cotton that nobody wanted to buy, while the children of the textile workers in New England were going to school in shirts that had been patched until the original fabric was nothing more than a memory. We had succeeded in inventing a system where having too much food caused starvation, and having too much clothing caused the population to go naked. It was a triumph of human ingenuity that defied all the laws of nature and common sense, delivered with the absolute approval of the highest authorities on political economy. The wisdom of the seller. The politicians looked upon the wreckage of their own making and concluded that the only possible solution was to double down on the medicine. If a modest tariff hadn't cured the patient, they reasoned, a thorough embargo would surely do the trick. They ran about like chickens in a thunderstorm, passing new regulations to protect the home market, apparently under the impression that if you can only keep $1 from leaving the country, it will somehow breed in the cellar and produce a family of quarters before the spring thaw. They forgot that a trade is a transaction that requires two parties, and that if you do not buy from the man across the lane, he will eventually run out of the pennies necessary to buy from you. The international ledger was showing a total breakdown of the machinery of trust. We had traded the grand cooperative marketplace of the 20s for a collection of small suspicious shops where every proprietor stood behind the counter with a club in his hand, watching his customers with the squinting eye of a detective who suspects everyone is planning to leave without settling the account. As 1931 dragged its heavy feet toward the winter, the fluctuations of trade had become a downward spiral into the mud. The nations had succeeded in isolating themselves beautifully. They were safe from foreign competition, safe from foreign goods, and entirely safe from foreign prosperity. They sat in their locked houses, looking at their surpluses of rotting wheat and rusting steel, wondering, with a distinct sense of intellectual vacancy, why the dawn of the new economic order felt so remarkably like a long, cold night in a barn with the doors off the hinges. We had tried to legislate ourselves into wealth by making everything expensive, and we were learning that the only thing we had successfully protected was our own right to be thoroughly, spectacularly broke. Chapter 18. The Literature of the Lean Years. There is a particular variety of high-minded humbug that flourishes exclusively in the parlors of the comfortable, which holds that the human soul is a majestic, independent bird that takes no account of what is happening inside the human stomach. The philosophers will tell you that true art is eternal, that it sits upon a cloud far above the vulgar fluctuations of the marketplace, and that a genuine writer spends his days contemplating the beautiful, the true, and the good, entirely unbothered by such mundane considerations as the price of onions or the arrival of the landlord's collector. But if you take a walk through the literary quarters of New York, London, or Paris in the chilly autumn of 1931, you will quickly discover that the muse, for all her grand reputation, is a lady who requires a regular supply of beefsteaks if she is to maintain her inspiration. When the world is fat, prosperous, and riding a wave of unearned dividends, she is prone to wearing silk stockings, drinking forbidden champagne, and writing long, complicated novels about the existential sadness of having too many servants. But when the ledger turns gray, when the banks lock their vaults, and the pavement becomes the primary place of residence for 1,000,000 honest citizens, the muse packs her evening gown into a trunk, puts on a threadbare coat, and takes a walk down the sidewalk to see what the folks in the bread line are talking about. The Death of the Champagne novel. To understand the absolute revolution that struck the bookshops in 1931, one must first look back at the grand literary landscape of the decade that preceded it. The 20s had been an era of the most exquisite, decorative gloom. We had been treated to a steady procession of novels featuring pale, young Ivy League graduates who spent 300 pages driving expensive motor cars through the European countryside, lounging on the beaches of the Riviera and weeping into their gin fizzes because they felt that life had lost its flavor. It was the literature of the lost generation, and it was a magnificent business while the boom lasted. The reader, having just made a tidy sum in the stock market by purchasing shares in a company that manufactured nothing more substantial than air, could sit in his armchair and enjoy the profound, luxurious tragedy of a character who had $4 million but couldn't find happiness anywhere on the planet. It was a beautiful variety of sorrow, a sorrow that came with a silver ice bucket and a jazz band playing in the background. But by 1931, that particular brand of tragedy had gone entirely out of style. The ordinary fellow on the street, having discovered that his own bank account had vanished into thin air like a morning mist, found that he had lost his capacity to feel sorry for the rich young men in white linen trousers. If a character in a book was going to be miserable, the reader demanded that he be miserable for a sensible, practical reason, such as not having the price of a nickel cup of coffee, or watching his furniture being set out on the curb in the rain because he couldn't satisfy the mortgage. A man can look upon the spiritual emptiness of a millionaire with a great deal of Christian patience when his own pocketbook is full. But when his boots are leaking and his dinner consists of boiled cabbage, he develops a sudden healthy appetite for looking at a scoundrel who is in precisely the same fix. The publishers, those sensitive short-sleeved barometers of public taste, looked at their warehouses full of unread society novels and realized that the wind had shifted. The public didn't want to read about the frivolities of the jazz age. They wanted the grit of the sidewalk. They wanted prose that smelled of coal smoke, damp wool, and the greasy steam rising from a soup kitchen. The rise of the sidewalk realists. This sudden change in the market produced a new breed of literary artist, the proletarian writer. He was a fellow who didn't live in a villa in the south of France, nor did he spend his evenings discussing the finer points of French poetry in a smoky cafe. He was usually found in a drafty cold water flat, typing with gloves on to keep his fingers from freezing, and his characters were men named Silas, John, or Red, men who worked the forge, drove the rivets into the skyscrapers, or stood in the dust of the Kansas plains watching their topsoil blow away toward the Atlantic Ocean. The style of these new books was as raw and blunt as a blow from a hickory stick. The long, beautiful adjectives of the previous decade were ruthlessly pruned away by the editors, replaced by short, snapping verbs that moved with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a factory press. A character didn't gaze pensively across the shimmering expanse of the harbor while reflecting upon the fleeting nature of youth. He stood in the mud, looked at the empty factory gate, and spat into the gutter. It was called social realism, and it was delivered with the earnest, sweat-browed intensity of a preacher who has discovered that his congregation has stopped paying their tithe. The novels of 1931 were populated by the dispossessed tenant, a proud farmer who has been driven off his land by a combination of the drought and the bank, traveling west in a rickety Ford that is held together by wire and prayer. The unemployed machinist, a fellow who walks the stone canyons of Chicago day after day, his knuckles red from the cold, looking for an hour's labor while the great machines inside the locked buildings sit silent and dark as monuments in a graveyard. The strike leader, a fiery, short-sleeved orator who stands on a wooden crate outside the mill gates, dodging the clubs of the company guards while trying to convince his comrades that the future belongs to the fellow who holds the wrench. The critics, those grand, scholarly watchdogs of the literary establishment, were in a state of high ecstasy. They had spent years worrying that American literature was becoming too soft, too European, and too thoroughly entangled in the decorations of the drawing room. Now that the crash had cleared away the upholstery, they wrote long, enthusiastic reviews in the journals, declaring that the national prose had finally found its true voice in the misery of the population. They spoke of the power of the dirt and the unvarnished truth of the pavement, apparently under the comfortable impression that a writer dying of tuberculosis in a basement was a magnificent victory for the development of American style. the irony of the gloomy page. There was, of course, a grand and whimsical irony sitting at the heart of this literary movement, the people who were actually living the stories, the men who were standing in the breadlines, the women who were stretching a single turnip over a 3-day stew, and the youth who were riding the rods across the country, didn't read these books at all. They couldn't afford to buy them, for one thing, and for another, they had no earthly desire to spend their few leisure hours reading a detailed description of the very misery they had been trying to escape all morning. If an unemployed carpenter had a dime to spare for a magazine or a book, he didn't look for a volume of proletarian realism that would remind him of his empty cupboard. He looked for a story about a cowboy who could ride a horse at a gallop through a forest of bullets without ever losing his hat, or a tale about a detective who could solve a murder mystery in a grand mansion while consuming a 3-course dinner that included a roast duck and a bottle of port. The realism was purchased chiefly by the folks who had managed to save their money from the general wreck, the comfortable middle-class citizens who read about the sufferings of the poor with a pleasant, tingling sense of moral virtue, satisfying their conscience by weeping over the misfortunes of a fictional bricklayer before sitting down to their own chicken dinner. The real misery. The writer's ink. The critic's praise. The wealthy reader's tears. We had succeeded in turning poverty into a branch of the decorative arts. The lean years were being codified, indexed, and bound in cloth covers with gold lettering, proving that there is no human calamity so profound that it cannot be turned into a commodity by a clever publisher and a writer with a good eye for the local color. The balance sheet of the pen. As 1931 drew toward its long, dark winter, the literature of the world had become a mirror of its general confusion. We had learned that necessity is indeed the mother of a very gloomy prose. The grand, confident stories of human progress, the books that told us how our machinery, our science, and our investments were going to turn the planet into a paradise of continuous leisure, were tossed into the dark corners of the library where they sat covered in dust, looking as foolish and outdated as a calendar from 1928. We were learning to look at ourselves without our makeup, and the image that looked back from the printed page was a rough, battered, and thoroughly sobered creature. It was a literature of survival, a ledger of endurance, written by men who had discovered that the world was not a parlor designed for our amusement, but a hard, cold field where a fellow had to fight for his footing every inch of the way. It was not a cheerful read, to be sure, but it possessed a certain rugged honesty that had been missing from our lives during the fat years. A reminder that when all the humbug of the boom is stripped away, the only thing that truly matters is the strength of the man who holds the pen and his willingness to tell the truth about the storm, even if he has to write it with a trembling hand on a scrap of wrapping paper. Chapter 19. The Winter of '31. December has ever been a month that carries a heavy burden of public expectation. In the ordinary course of human events, it arrives at the end of the calendar like a grand red-faced uncle, his pockets stuffed with peppermint drops, his boots smelling of cedar smoke, and his general disposition inclined toward the singing of loud, cheerful songs by the parlor fire. We look to December to forgive the follies of the previous 11 months, to wrap our failures in a clean blanket of white snow, and to convince us through the magic of a turkey dinner and a glass of hot punch, that the human race is, despite all evidence to the contrary, a fairly decent outfit to belong to. But as the year of our Lord 1931 drew its final ragged breaths, December arrived in a completely different character. It came like a cold-eyed bailiff, with a ledger under his arm, a frost-bitten nose, and an explicit instruction to see if there was anything left in the house worth seizing for the interest on the debt. It was a winter that did not merely settle upon the fields and the rooftops. It crept through the keyholes, found its way past the heavy wool of our waistcoats, and parked its icy boots directly next to the human heart. The great frost of the spirit. There is a vast structural difference between a standard winter, the kind that freezes the pond so the boys can skate and turns a man's breath into a plume of white steam, and a winter of the spirit. A natural frost is a temporary inconvenience, a seasonal argument between the sun and the north wind that everyone knows will be settled by April. A man can endure a great deal of cold if he knows his woodpile is high, his pork barrel is full, and his neighbor is in precisely the same condition of hearty, rustic survival. But the cold of 1931 was an artificial man-made draft that seemed to have been piped directly out of the empty vaults of the central banks. It was a frost that stripped away the remaining illusions of the boom years with the ruthless efficiency of a skinning knife. For 2 long years, the population had been living on a diet of deferred hope, treating the economic collapse as if it were a sudden passing summer storm that would eventually blow over if everyone only kept their umbrellas up and continued to speak politely of the administration. By December, however, the umbrellas were thoroughly worn through, the ribs were broken, and the rain had turned into a sleet that bit down to the bone. The illusion of 1929, to the patience of 1930, to the hard ice of 1931. The physical landscape of the great cities took on a grim, monotonous coloration. The stone sidewalks seemed harder. The gray stone of the buildings looked more imposing, and the smoke rising from the chimneys was thin and pale, reflecting the desperate economy of families who were counting their coal lumps as if they were diamonds. In the small towns of the interior, the situation was no more cheerful. The country stores, which had once been the repositories of local wit, tobacco smoke, and loud arguments over the merits of various baseball players, were strangely quiet. The men sat around the cold stove, their hands shoved deep into their pockets, their eyes fixed upon the floorboards with that peculiar unblinking stillness that belongs exclusively to a fellow who has run out of credit and ideas at the exact same moment. The shortage of profits. The most notable casualty of this long, hard winter was the sudden, spectacular bankruptcy of the professional optimist. In the months following the initial crash, the air had been absolutely thick with prophets, gentlemen of high financial standing, politicians with large majorities, and professors of political economy who made a very comfortable living by assuring the public that prosperity is just around the corner. They spoke of the market as if it were a temperamental maiden who had merely suffered a temporary fit of the vapors, and who would surely return to her senses if we only provided her with enough cheerful speeches and a reasonable amount of time to compose her dress. But by the end of 1931, the public had developed a profound, deep-seated weariness regarding the geography of that particular corner. They had walked around it so many times, looking for the promised land, that their boots were entirely worn out, and they had found nothing on the other side but another stretch of gray pavement, another row of locked factory gates, and another collection of municipal notices regarding the collection of back taxes. A prophet is a most convenient piece of furniture to have in the house when the weather is fair and the crops are growing. But when the roof falls in and the kitchen is flooded, his habit of pointing toward the horizon and predicting a beautiful sunrise becomes an offense against decency that is liable to get him assisted out of the door with the toe of a boot. If a fellow stood up in a public square in December of 1931 to declare that the bottom had finally been reached, that the natural forces of recovery were currently gathering their strength for a magnificent leap into a new dawn, the crowd did not cheer. They did not even argue with him. They simply looked at his clean collar, checked the condition of his hat, and walked away with a silent, heavy skepticism that was far more lethal than any amount of shouting. We had become a nation of doubters, a civilization that had traded its old, reckless faith in tomorrow for a cold, defensive calculation of today. The ledger of suspicion. This sudden premium on skepticism transformed the very nature of human intercourse. In the fat years, trust had been rolled out like pie crust, cheap and plentiful. A man would invest his savings in a company he had never seen, managed by men he had never met, on the strength of a rumor he had overheard in a barber shop from a fellow who had once spoken to a plumber from Wall Street. We believed in everything. In the immortality of the stock market, in the wisdom of the captains of industry, and in the divine right of the American dollar to buy twice as much today as it did yesterday. But in the winter of '31, the ledger of suspicion was open on every counter. We no longer trusted the bank, a building that had once looked like a Greek temple designed to inspire awe and moral rectitude, was now viewed as a suspicious fortress that might decide to lock its iron gates midway through a Tuesday afternoon. The newspaper, the headlines that spoke of a stabilization of prices or a revival of trade, were treated with the same healthy skepticism one reserves for a circus poster promising a three-headed calf. The government, the long rolling manifestos from Washington, designed to inject confidence into the veins of the nation through the needle of rhetoric, were received by the ordinary citizen with a low whistling grunt that indicated a total lack of intellectual penetration. We had learned, through a series of expensive lessons delivered by history, with a heavy ruler across our knuckles, that a promise is not an asset, that a speech is not a dinner, and that a leader is often just a fellow who is just as confused as the rest of the crowd, but who happens to have been provided with a louder megaphone. The hardening of the soul. As the year ticked toward its absolute conclusion, as the cold nights grew longer and the wind from the north took on a sharp, whistling edge that sounded remarkably like the ghost of the late boom market mourning its lost millions, the world began to hunker down for a long siege. The excitement of the initial panic was gone, replaced by the heavy rhythmic grind of survival. We were no longer panicking, we were enduring. And that, as any old soldier will tell you, is a much more formidable condition of mind. The human race was growing colder, no doubt, but it was also growing spectacularly wiser. We were learning to distinguish between the things that are real, such as a warm coat, a hot potato, and a reliable friend, and the things that are merely humbug, such as a paper profit, a political slogan, or a certificate of stock in a company that manufactured nothing but expectations. It was a rude, painful awakening, an awakening that left us with a great deal of grime on our faces and a distinct ache in our heads. But as we stood in the snow at the end of 1931, watching the old year bleed out into the dark, we held our hats down against the gale, braced our feet against the slippery ice, and prepared to face whatever foolishness the future had in store for us, with a grim, silent determination that no amount of frost was ever going to be able to conquer. Chapter 20. The Balance Sheet. When a bookkeeper sits down at the close of a tempestuous year to strike his final balance sheet, he does so with a certain professional comfort. He possesses two neat, parallel columns. He has his assets on the left, his liabilities on the right, and he knows with mathematical certainty that if he can only coax the one side to match the other down to the last copper cent, he may close the ledger, blow out his candle, and go to bed with the clean conscience of a man who has successfully corralled the universe into a row of figures. It is a marvelous humbug, this belief that the wild, unruly doings of humanity can be completely summarized by a pair of double lines drawn across the bottom of a page of foolscap. But history is a notoriously poor accountant. It does not use standard ink. It regularly spills coffee over its own pages, and it has an absolute incurable habit of misplacing the receipts. When we look back across the 12 months of the year of our Lord 1931 and attempt to draft a grand final audit of our collective stumbles and strivings, we discover that the columns refuse to stay straight. The decimals have all gone out to play, and the profit and loss statement looks remarkably like the floor of a saloon after a multi-factioned election dispute. The grand audit of folly. If we were to take an honest, unvarnished inventory of the year's transactions, we would have to admit that our liabilities column was spectacularly well garrisoned. The year began with a financial hiccup in Vienna that quickly proved to the world that our modern civilized pocketbooks were all stitched together with the same thread. When the Creditanstalt unraveled, the trousers of global finance came down with a sudden, humiliating rush. We saw the Hoover Moratorium, a noble piece of bureaucratic procrastination that attempted to cure an international debt hemorrhage by declaring a holiday from arithmetic. The abdication of gold, the grand old British Empire stepping off its glittering anchor and leaving the pound sterling to float away upon the shifting winds of pure imagination. The paralysis of Geneva, the League of Nations sitting in its white palace, hand-wringing with a rhythmic regularity that would have been magnificent had it not been entirely useless against the sound of boots marching across Manchuria. It was a 12-month chronicle of institutions cracking at the joints, of treaties being treated as convenient waste paper, and of national leaders running about with fire buckets that turned out to be completely empty. We spent the year building walls against our neighbor's trade, apparently under the impression that a country can become wealthy by the simple expedient of making everything within its borders entirely too expensive for anyone to buy. We managed to invent a brand new variety of misery, a crisis where having too much wheat caused people to starve, and having too much cotton left the children to go naked in the winter gale. The ingenious and the absurd. Yet, if a man were to look exclusively at that dark side of the ledger, he would be guilty of misrepresenting the true character of the species. For the grand, ridiculous joke of human history is that we are never quite so industrious as when we are thoroughly ruined. While the political floorboards were groaning and the banks were locking their gates, the ingenious mechanics of the race were busy turning out wonders that would have made our grandfathers suspect the world had been taken over by sorcerers. Humanity is a creature that will spend its morning losing its fortune in a bankrupt bank, its afternoon building a silver tower to the very stars, and its evening sitting in the dark listening to a wooden box tell it how bad the weather is in Chicago. We rolled out structural steel and piled up the Empire State Building in the middle of a bread line, proving that even when we are sliding down the bank into the creek, we like to do it with our flags flying from the highest peak. We domesticated the polar frost, trapping the summer inside a pack of frozen peas so that a clerk could enjoy the taste of June while his coal grate was empty in January. We tracked down the neutron, the quiet, neutral ghost of the subatomic cellar, completely unaware that we had just found the key to the powder magazine of the universe. We even sent a giant silver whale of an airship to float over the Arctic ice just to show the polar bears that we could partake in hot turtle soup in a place where nature clearly never intended a man to draw a breath. The years collapse. Blah. Produces cast skyscrapers, radios, and freezers. It was a magnificent, contradictory spectacle. We proved ourselves to be entirely incapable of managing our own abundance or balancing our own budgets. Yet we could tame gravity, harness the ether, and rewrite the geography of the elements to suit our whim. We were like a family that couldn't figure out how to divide a loaf of bread among the children without a fist fight, but could nevertheless build a magnificent pipe organ in the parlor and play a fugue that would bring tears to the eyes of an angel. The balance sheet of culture. In the cultural quarters, the ledger showed an identical turning of the leaf. The frivolities of the old jazz days were packed away into the cellar like an old suit of clothes that had grown too tight across the waistcoat. Hollywood discovered that the public, being entirely poor, had developed a healthy, robust appetite for watching celluloid bandits break the law with a flourish, while the real-world models for those bandits were being brought low by a few quiet gentlemen armed with nothing more lethal than sharp pencils and addition tables. We lost the grace of Pavlova, her empty spotlight moving across a dark stage in London like a phantom swan, leaving us to navigate a world that was becoming increasingly loud, heavy, and mechanical. And in the dust of Scottsboro, we were treated to a grim, sobering reminder that our grand systems of jurisprudence are often nothing more than a thin coat of respectable paint over the old, wild instinct of the mob. A reminder that civilization is a very fragile contract indeed, and one that requires constant vigilance if it is to be kept from being torn to pieces by the winds of prejudice. The tightrope and the horizon. And so we arrived at the end of the journey. The winter of '31 settled upon the earth, not with the cheerful promise of a holiday, but with the cold, hard reality of a ledger that had to be settled in full. We had grown poorer, no doubt. Our bank books were thin, our coats were threadbare, and our pockets contained more lint than gold. But by George, we had grown spectacularly wise. We had shed the easy, reckless illusions of the previous decade, and we were learning to look at the world without our makeup on. The world in 1931. A man walking a tightrope in a gale, He had the presence of mind to keep moving, though he had forgotten entirely why he had climbed onto the wire in the first place. That, in the end, is the true balance sheet of the year. We remained on the wire. The wind howled, the floorboards wobbled, the clouds gathered dark and heavy, with the promise of even leaner years to come. But the human race did not lie down in the mud and give up the ghost. It braced its feet, held its hat down against the gale, and kept on walking. It is not a straight line, this progress of ours. It is a series of stumbles, a clumsy, staggering march from one folly to the next, and we are remarkably lucky to survive even half of them. But as the final ticks of the clock put an end to 1931, the old ledger was closed, the red ink was blotted, and the world stood shivering in the snow, looking toward the horizon with a distinct sense of suspicion, a healthy amount of doubt, and that stubborn, unquenchable human determination to see what kind of nonsense the next 12 months had written on the clean pages of tomorrow.